Hey everyone, tonight we're going all the way back to the beginning. Not just ancient history the way we usually mean it, but the first time human thoughts got pressed into something solid enough to outlast the people who had them. Picture a small lump of wet clay in someone's palm, a reed stylus in the other hand, and then these tiny wedge-shaped marks tapped and dragged in quick little motions, line after line. That writing is older than the pyramids, older than the oldest books you've ever held, and somehow those marks survived. Thousands of years later, we can still read them. Before we settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of slow, deep, late-night history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel and how many different nights we're sharing at once. Alright, lights down. Maybe a fan on low for that steady background hum. And let's ease into it. Tonight we're heading to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is the place where humans first learned to write, first built true cities, and first recorded stories about the gods in a way that can still speak to us now. And in those stories, one name keeps showing up like a shadow behind the earliest chapters of civilization, the Anunnaki. Now you've probably heard the word before. Pop culture loves to grab it and run in the wildest direction possible. But what's fascinating is that we don't have to rely on modern theories or internet myths for this. We have real tablets, real cities, real people. People who lived in the dust and heat of southern Iraq 5,000 years ago, who looked up at the same stars we look at and asked the same questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What powers shape the world? And they wrote their answers down. The Sumerians weren't simple villagers telling cute bedtime myths. They were urban people living in complex city-states. They built massive temple towers. They invented systems for measuring grain, land, and time. They developed mathematics, legal practices, engineering, and astronomy that still echoes in our lives today. They weren't guessing at the world. They were organising it. And their stories about the Anunnaki weren't meant as casual fiction. These were sacred histories to them. Explanations of how reality worked. Why things were the way they were. Why humans laboured. Why kings ruled. Why storms destroyed. Why floods came. Why death was unavoidable. So to understand what the texts say happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, we have to first understand the world the Sumerians lived in and why that world produced stories like these in the first place. Imagine standing onto flat plains of southern Mesopotamia. The land is wide and open and the sky feels enormous. In summer it's brutally hot. The wind kicks up dust. The ground can look dead and cracked. And then you see the rivers. Without them, nothing grows. With them, everything changes. If you can control their water, if you can dig canals and manage floods, you can turn harsh land into farmland. You can feed thousands of people. You can build cities. But here's the catch. These rivers were unpredictable. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, which flooded in a more regular rhythm, the Tigris and Euphrates could be temperamental and violent. Floods could come fast and ruin everything, or the water could fail and drought could drag on until fields died. The rivers brought life, but they also brought fear. And that unpredictability shaped the Sumerian imagination. Their gods were powerful, yes, but also changeable, capable of generosity and destruction, like the rivers themselves. The earliest settlements in this region go back to around 6000 BCE, but the civilization we call Sumer really begins to emerge around 4000 BCE, during what archaeologists call the Uruk period. Uruk was one of the first truly massive cities on Earth. And when I say massive, I mean it. At its peak, Uruk covered more than 2 square miles and may have held close to 100,000 people. That's staggering for that time. Most humans on the planet were still living in small villages or moving with herds. Uruk was a different kind of life entirely. Other cities rose too. Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the first city, the one founded by the gods themselves, Nippur, the sacred religious centre where Enlil, one of the supreme gods, was said to dwell. Lagash, Kish, Shuruppak, each its own city-state, with its own ruler, its own patron deity, its own rivalries. And these city-states weren't peaceful little neighbours. They fought, often. Water rights, canals, borders, prestige. In a landscape where survival depended on irrigation control of water was power. And power was always contested. Here's another detail that matters. The Sumerians didn't have easy access to stone. There wasn't a convenient quarry right nearby for giant monuments, so they built with what they had. Mud. They made mud bricks dried in the sun, or fired in kilns, and they used them to build everything: houses, walls, storehouses, and the most iconic structures of their world, the ziggurats, huge stepped temple towers, rising above the flat land like artificial mountains. These weren't just places to pray. Temples were economic centres, administrative headquarters, storehouses, workshops, and inside them a specialised class of people managed everything: priests, officials, and especially scribes. And the scribes are the reason we're here tonight. Because writing didn't begin as poetry, it began as accounting. The earliest tablets, dating to around 3300 BCE, are records: grain, livestock, oil, labour, lists and tallies that helped a complex city keep itself running. Over time, those simple marks evolved into cuneiform, a writing system capable of expressing almost anything: laws, math, astronomy, letters, and eventually myth and theology. And when scribes started recording sacred stories around 2500 BCE, they were putting into clay traditions that were already ancient to them. Oral stories passed down for generations, now pinned in place with wedge marks. This is where the Anunnaki enter the written record. The word appears across Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, and scholars still debate the exact nuance, but it's often understood as something like princely offspring, or those of royal blood. In many early contexts, it refers to the great gods as a collective, the high-ranking divine powers linked to Anu, the sky god, and Ki, the earth. In later traditions, the term shifts. Sometimes it points to underworld gods, sometimes to earth-dwelling divine judges, sometimes to a vast hierarchy of deities spread across heaven, earth, and the world below. So when people ask, who were the Anunnaki? The honest answer is that the texts don't treat them like one simple single group with one fixed job title. They're a divine class, a high order, the big powers who run the structure of reality, and among them certain gods stand out because their personalities shape the entire mythic world. At the top is Anu, the sky itself, father of the gods. But Anu is distant, almost like a remote authority who exists more as a cosmic fact than a daily character. The god who actually governs in many Sumerian traditions is Enlil, lord of the air storms and authority. His temple at Nippur is the heart of religious power. Enlil is stern, he is order. He is the force that says, this is how things must be. He's not gentle, and when humans become a problem, Enlil is the one who reaches for drastic solutions. Then there's Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea. And Enki feels like the counterweight. Where Enlil is strict authority, Enki is cleverness and compassion. He's tied to fresh water, to the deep subterranean waters called the Abzu, but he's also the god of wisdom, craft magic, and problem solving. In story after story, Enki has this instinct to preserve life, to rescue, to bend rules when the rules become cruel. And alongside them is the mother goddess Ninhursag, also called by names like Ninmah or Mami in different traditions. She's fertility birth, the earth's creative power. In many creation stories, she plays a central role in shaping humans, bringing life into form. And then there's Inanna, later called Ishtar, goddess of love, sex fertility, and war. And if Enlil is order and Enki is wisdom, Inanna is intensity, desire, ambition, power. She can be radiant and terrifying in the same breath. Her myths are full of bold choices, risk, conflict, and transformation. This is the divine world the Sumerians lived with. Not abstract forces floating in the clouds, but personalities with rivalries, alliances, and decisions that shape human fate. And according to the text, the most important decision they ever made was about us. Because in these stories, humans don't appear by accident. Humans are created for a reason. And that reason in the ancient Mesopotamian imagination is going to lead us straight into one of the most striking creation narratives in human history. So how do humans enter this world of gods, canals, temples, and divine politics? In these texts, humans are not created because the gods feel lonely, or because they want friends, or because they're curious. Humans are created because somebody has to do the work. The hard work, the relentless work, the kind of work that breaks backs and consumes years. One of the clearest versions of this story shows up in the Atrahasis tradition, written in Akkadian later, but drawing on older Sumerian ideas that were already circulating for a long time. And the setup is simple, almost blunt. The world needs to be organised. Canals need to be dug. Dikes need to be built. Fields need to be irrigated. Water needs to be controlled so cities can exist at all. And the great gods, the high-ranking divine powers, are not going to pick up baskets of mud and do it themselves. So the labour falls to a younger class of gods, often called the Igigi, the divine workforce. They are still gods, still supernatural, still powerful, but they're treated like labourers under command. For years and years they dig and haul and build. Some versions say 40 years. Others push it into symbolic, enormous time spans. Either way, the point is the same. They are exhausted, they are bitter, and eventually they decide they've had enough. The rebellion begins at night, and it feels almost cinematic. The younger gods gather in secret whispering and arguing, working themselves into a shared fury. They've been digging canals like beasts, serving the comfort of higher gods, who sit in authority and demand more. Then they march. In the dark hours before dawn, they surround Enlil's dwelling, the centre of authority, and they burn their tools. Imagine that moment. A ring of divine workers throwing their picks and baskets into flames, turning the symbols of forced labour into smoke. It's protest and threat at the same time. They pound on the gates, they shout, they demand a change. And what's so striking is how the story describes Enlil's reaction. Enlil, Lord of Order, the one who commands storms and decrees fates, is shaken. He is alarmed. He calls for help. A council is summoned. Anu, the distant Skyfather, is involved. Enki, the clever god of wisdom, is called in. The divine leadership has to deal with a labour crisis. And the first impulse, especially from a figure like Enlil, is punishment. Find the ringleaders, crush the rebellion, restore order through fear. But Enki comes in from another angle. He doesn't deny the problem, he reframes it. Instead of trying to force the younger gods back into labour, Enki proposes something that changes everything. Create a new kind of being. Create workers who are not gods. Create humans. The council hesitates because creation is not a casual act. You can't just invent a new class of life without consequences. But the pressure is real. The divine workforce is already on the edge. If they push too hard, the whole system collapses. So the gods agree. Humans will be made. Now comes the next question, and it's the heart of the myth. What are humans made from? The answer in these texts is unsettling and strangely intimate. Humans are made from clay, but not clay alone. Clay is earth. It is lifeless. It needs a spark. It needs something divine, something that carries awareness, intelligence, understanding. So the gods select a lesser deity to be sacrificed. Different versions give different names, but the role is consistent. This god carries a quality of mind, a kind of divine perception, and the essence will be transferred into the new beings. The god is killed in the assembly. His blood is collected. The blood is mixed with clay from the ground. Earth and heaven combined in a bowl. And then the mother goddess, often named Ninhursag in Sumerian tradition, steps forward as the one who knows how to shape life. She is the womb of the world, the one who turns material into living form. She takes the mixture and begins to form humans. Not one but many. Some versions describe 14-7 male and 7 female, shaped in a deliberate pattern. There's something almost procedural about it, like the gods are establishing a repeatable process. The texts can sound less like a lightning bolt miracle and more like a careful production. Pieces of the mixture are shaped. Incantations are spoken. The forms are placed into a setting that feels like a managed gestation, a controlled birthing. When the first humans emerge, they are exactly what the gods needed. Bodies capable of labour, minds capable of instruction, mortal enough to be commanded, clever enough to understand tasks, a strange blend of earth and divinity, and the gods put them to work immediately. Humans are shown how to dig canals, how to maintain irrigation, how to cultivate fields, how to carry the weight of civilization. The younger gods are released from their exhausting labour. The divine hierarchy is stabilized. The gods can return to their roles while humans become the engine that keeps the world functioning. If you listen closely to what this story is saying, it's not just an origin tale. It's a statement about work, about who carries the burden of building society, about how an organised world is always built on somebody's labour. And then the story takes a turn because humans do what living beings do. They multiply. At first it's a small workforce, then it's families, then it's generations, then it's entire communities spreading across the land. Humans are described as intensely fertile, and before long they are everywhere. They cultivate more land, they build settlements, they create noise, and the noise becomes the problem. This detail shows up again and again, and it's almost funny on the surface until you sit with it. The humans created to serve have become loud enough to disturb the gods, especially Enlil. The text frames it as a disruption of divine rest, but it can also be understood as something deeper. Humanity is no longer quiet and contained. Human life has momentum, it has presence, it has its own energy, its own needs, its own chaos. Enlil decides the population must be reduced, so he tries a plague first. The disease spreads, humans suffer, they cry out, and Enki hears them. Enki's response is clever, almost practical in its own way. He instructs humans to focus their prayers and offerings toward the specific divine force tied to the plague, to feed that power, appease it, and persuade it to ease off. And the plague recedes. Humanity survives. Enlil tries again, this time drought. Rain is withheld, crops fail, hunger spreads. Again humans cry out. Again Enki intervenes, redirecting devotion and ritual attention to the right divine channel, the power that can loosen the sky and release water. Rain returns. The famine breaks. Enlil tries again with another wave of hardship, another tightening of survival. And again Enki finds a way around it, like a god who keeps slipping a lock open from the inside. Sometimes the texts describe fish swarming in such abundance that humans can live without grain. Sometimes the details shift, but the pattern stays sharp. Enlil is trying to enforce limits. Enki is trying to preserve life. And every time humanity is pushed toward collapse, Enki tilts the scales back towards survival. Eventually Enlil loses patience with partial measures. In his view, the problem is not sickness or drought. The problem is humanity itself. And that is when the story begins moving toward a decision so extreme it becomes one of the most famous mythic events in human memory. A flood. Not a seasonal overflow, not a bad storm, but a total destruction meant to erase the human world completely. And this time Enlil demands secrecy. The gods must swear an oath, no warning, no loopholes, no mercy communicated to humans. The council agrees. Even Enki is bound by the oath. And now the tension becomes almost unbearable, because Enki, the defender of humanity, has to decide what wisdom looks like when the rules are designed to eliminate every possible chance of survival. Enki is trapped by a promise. The gods have decided the flood will happen, and they've sworn an oath that no one will warn humanity. The destruction has to be complete, clean, final. No survivors, no rebuilding, no lingering human noise to irritate divine rest ever again. But Enki is not the kind of god who accepts a decision just because it's written into a council decree. In these myths, Enki is the one who finds cracks in the rules, the one who understands that a clever mind can obey the letter of an oath while saving the spirit of what matters. So he finds a loophole. He cannot speak directly to a human about the coming flood, but he can speak to something else. And the oath doesn't say anything about talking to a wall. That's how the story frames it, almost with a quiet grin, as if the ancient storyteller knew exactly how satisfying this trick was. Enki goes to the home of a man named Atrahasis, a name that means something like exceedingly wise. Atrahasis is described as devout, respectful, the kind of man who honours the gods properly, not a rebel, not a troublemaker, just a human doing what humans do, trying to live within the divine system. Enki stands outside his reed house and begins speaking not to Atrahasis, but to the wall itself. He talks as if the wall is his listener. He describes the flood that is about to come. He explains what it will do. He gives instructions in careful detail. Build a boat. Make it large enough for your family. Seal it with bitumen so water cannot enter. Prepare supplies. Gather animals. Do it quickly. Atrahasis. Inside the house, hears every word, and Enki has technically kept the oath. He spoke to the wall. The wall simply happened to let the message pass through. Atrahasis understands immediately. This is not a normal warning. This is divine information, and divine information comes with a time limit. He begins building at once. Now imagine what this would look like to everyone else. A man in a dry city hauling materials, shaping wood, organising labour, constructing a massive vessel on land where boats don't belong. People would stare. People would laugh. People would ask questions. Atrahasis needs an explanation because fear spreads fast and fear draws attention. Enki gives him a cover story. Atrahasis tells his neighbours that Enlil has rejected him, that he's no longer welcome, and that he's going to leave the city and travel down to the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm, to dwell with Enki. It's a strange explanation, but it has a divine flavour. People in a world like this don't always challenge divine strangeness. They might think he's lost his mind, or they might think he's involved in some religious conflict too big for them to understand. Either way, they don't stop him. Atrahasis works with desperate speed. The boat takes shape. Supplies are gathered. Food, water, tools, seed animals. Family members are brought in. The world outside continues with its normal rhythms, unaware that the clock has started. Then the flood arrives. The texts describe it like a release of violence. The sky darkens. Thunder rolls. Rain begins, but it's not ordinary rain. It's as if the heavens have opened like a torn skin. Water pours down in sheets. The rivers swell. Canals overflow. Fields become lakes. Streets vanish. And the water keeps rising. People run. Livestock bellow. Homes collapse. The sound of human panic becomes part of the storm and then is swallowed by it. The world becomes water and noise and chaos. Atrahasis and those with him are sealed inside the boat. They feel the rocking, the tossing, the impact of debris hitting the hull. They hear the roar outside and know that everything familiar is being erased. The storm lasts for days. Different versions give different counts, but the sense is the same. This isn't an afternoon disaster. This is a sustained annihilation. And one of the most haunting parts of the story is what the gods themselves do during this event. They are horrified. The gods who voted for the flood, who agreed humanity should be destroyed, were not prepared for the reality of mass death. The texts describe them fleeing upward, cowering in the highest heavens like frightened animals pressed against the edge of the cosmos. The mother goddess weeps. She laments the death of humans as if they are her children, because in the myth they are. She cries out in grief that they fill the sea like dead fish floating lifeless, endless. Even Inanna, fierce and powerful, is struck with regret. She swears by her jewellery that she will never forget the sight of what has happened. And there's another detail that is almost startling in its honesty. The gods are hungry. In this world, gods are not distant, self-sufficient abstractions. They eat through offerings. They are sustained by temple ritual. They receive food and drink through the system humans maintain. When humanity is wiped out, the temples go silent, fires go out. Bread is not baked for the gods. Beer is not poured. Meat is not offered. The gods begin to feel the absence of their own supply chain. They destroyed the humans who served them, and suddenly they realize what that means. The flood becomes a disaster, not only for mortals, but for the divine order itself. Eventually the rain stops. The violence ceases. The waters begin to recede. The boat settles on land, often described as a mountain or high place. Atrahasis waits, then opens an opening, and looks out into a world that feels empty, washed clean of life. He sends out birds to test whether the land is truly dry. One returns because there's nowhere to rest. Another returns. And finally, one does not come back. Which means the world is re-emerging from the water. Atrahasis steps out. The first thing he does is not build a house, not search for survivors, not wander in shock. He builds an altar. He offers a sacrifice. He burns meat and grain in gratitude and in reverence, and the smell rises into the air, and the gods gather to it. The texts describe them swarming around the sacrifice, desperate like flies drawn to food. It's a vivid, uncomfortable image, and that's why it sticks. It tells you exactly what kind of relationship this mythology imagines between gods and humans. Humans need protection. Gods need offerings. This is not one-sided devotion. It's mutual dependence wrapped in hierarchy. Then Enlil arrives, and Enlil is furious because humans survived. The plan was supposed to be total. The flood was supposed to erase the human presence completely, yet here is smoke rising from an altar. Here is ritual. Here is proof of survival. Enlil demands to know how this happened, who broke the oath, who warned them. The other gods look toward Enki because Enki has always been the one who leans toward humanity. Enki does not panic. He does not plead. He argues. He points out that destroying all humans was a mistake. Look at the hunger of the gods. Look at the grief of the mother goddess. Look at what the council unleashed. There has to be another way. Enlil is not easily persuaded, but even Enlil can see the practical reality. The gods cannot maintain their world without humans. If humans are wiped out, the divine system collapses into starvation and regret. So a compromise is forged. Humanity will continue, but measures will be put in place to prevent humans from multiplying into a problem again. And this is where the story turns into an explanation for many harsh aspects of human life. The texts describe new limits. Some women will be infertile. Some pregnancies will fail. Some births will end in death. Certain priestesses will be set apart, required to remain celibate. Human lifespan, which in mythic time had been much longer, will be reduced. Mortality becomes sharper, closer, more unavoidable. In other words, the world after the flood is the world humans recognize as normal. Life is fragile. Children can die. Mothers can die. Time is shorter. The population will never again be allowed to grow without restraint. Atrahasis himself is rewarded. In some versions, he and his wife are taken far away to a remote place at the edge of the world where rivers meet the sea. He is granted a kind of special status, almost like a bridge between humanity and divinity, because he carried life through destruction, and humanity begins again from the survivors from the family line preserved inside that sealed boat. Cities are rebuilt, fields are replanted, temples rise again, offerings return, the gods are fed again. The relationship between humans and divine power resumes, but it is altered. It is no longer just a simple arrangement where humans exist purely as labour. Now there is a sense of tension and negotiation. The gods need humans. Humans fear the gods. Both sides know what happens when that balance breaks. And as society reforms, the next development takes shape in the text's governance. The organisation of power. The idea that authority itself is something granted from above, something that is part of cosmic order, not merely human invention. In the mythic worldview, kingship is not created by humans as a political tool. Kingship is lowered from heaven. It arrives as a divine institution placed into specific cities, handed down as part of the structure of civilization itself. And once kingship appears, everything changes. Not because people suddenly become more human, but because power becomes centralized, sacred, and dangerously tied to the will of the gods. That is how the world becomes a place where law codes can be carved, where armies can march with divine banners, where temples become both spiritual centers and economic machines, and where the human city becomes the stage on which divine politics play out in stone, mud brick, and blood. In the Mesopotamian imagination, authority is not invented in a meeting of elders, and it's not seized by the strongest warlord with the biggest spear. Authority arrives like weather. It comes from above. The texts describe kingship as something that is lowered from heaven, an institution that the gods release into the human world the way they release rain into the fields. And when kingship arrives, it doesn't arrive everywhere at once. It lands in a city. It chooses a place. It becomes rooted. This is where those ancient king lists become more than simple lists of names. They read like myth and administration woven together, because the earliest kings are described as ruling for impossibly long spans, thousands of years, tens of thousands, lengths that feel less like human lifetimes and more like a way of saying these early rulers belong to an age that was closer to the gods. Whether those numbers represent literal years, symbolic counts, or dynastic totals, the effect is the same. The first age of kingship is portrayed as semi-divine. The ruler is not a normal man. He's an intermediary, a bridge between human needs and divine order. In practical terms, this idea explains why a king matters so much in a city built on canals and grain stores. Irrigation is not optional here. Without constant maintenance, a canal silts up, a dike breaks, a flood shifts course, water turns from life to catastrophe. A city in Mesopotamia survives only if thousands of people cooperate. That requires organisation, labour schedules, storage systems, distribution of rations, enforcement of rules, defence against rivals who might cut off water or seize farmland. So kingship in the mythic framework isn't simply a crown, it's a mechanism for keeping the world from sliding back into chaos. And the king does not stand alone. The palace and the temple form a paired system, two great engines of the city. The palace directs military and civil power. The temple directs divine relationship and economic management. Because temples in this world are not quiet chapels. They are enormous institutions. They own land. They employ workers. They run workshops. They store grain. They lend resources. They manage herds. They keep records. They distribute rations. They negotiate trade. If you want to understand how a city breathes, you follow the temple accounts. This is where scribes become quietly powerful. Scribes are not simply people who write pretty stories. Scribes are the ones who keep the machinery of civilization running. Every ration of barley, every delivery of wool, every contract, every complaint, every loan, every court decision, every offering. It all becomes marks pressed into clay. And those marks create a new kind of permanence. A spoken promise can vanish into air. A clay tablet can sit on a shelf for decades, holding memory in a physical form. Writing starts as administration, but administration is never just paperwork. Administration is control, and control becomes the skeleton of an organised society. So as kingship settles into the cities, law begins to take shape as something more than custom. It becomes something that can be declared, posted, copied, referenced. Even before famous law codes, you can feel this shift in the way texts talk about justice. Justice is not just a personal act. It is part of cosmic order. Kings are described as appointed to establish justice and remove oppression, not because every king does it well, but because the job itself is framed as sacred. And that framing is important because Mesopotamian society is deeply stratified. There are elites, commoners, dependent labourers, slaves. There are temples with wealth and land. There are merchants who travel and profit. There are farmers whose lives are bound to harvest cycles. There are captives taken in war and turned into property. A law system in such a world often protects hierarchy as much as it protects fairness. But it still matters that rules exist, because rules reduce chaos. Rules make transactions possible. Rules make people predictable. And in the worldview of these myths, predictability is a form of safety. Now, while kingship and law grow, culture grows as well. And one of the most fascinating aspects of Sumerian and Akkadian tradition is how quickly storytelling becomes sophisticated once writing matures. At first, tablets are lists and receipts. Then they become hymns, then proverbs, then laments, then myths that are not just simple tales but layered reflections on power, desire, mortality, and the limits of human control. And within that literary world, one figure rises like a monument: Gilgamesh. In the later, fuller epic, we know Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a ruler of Uruk whose strength is beyond normal measure. But strength does not automatically create wisdom. In fact, the early portion of his story is full of excess. He pushes boundaries. He demands too much. He makes his city suffer. The gods respond not by destroying him, but by shaping a counterweight. They create Enkidu. Enkidu begins as a wild man living among animals covered in hair, drinking at waterholes, existing outside the city's structure. He represents the wilderness, the untamed world that civilization tries to organize. When Enkidu is brought into human society, he changes. He learns food, drink, clothing, speech. He becomes, in the language of the culture, civilized. And then he meets Gilgamesh. Their clash becomes friendship, and that friendship becomes the engine of the epic's emotional force. Together they do great things, reckless things, heroic things, violent things. And then Enkidu dies. This death is the turning point, because for Gilgamesh, Enkidu's death is not just grief. It is a mirror. It tells him what he is, mortal. No matter how strong, no matter how famous, no matter how divine his bloodline, he will die. So Gilgamesh begins his search for what humans want most when they realize life has an end, a way around death. He searches for Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who received immortality. And when he finds him, the answer is devastating in its calmness. Immortality was a unique decision. It is not a prize that can be won through strength. And even when Gilgamesh gains a fragile chance, a plant that can restore youth, it is taken. A serpent steals it while he is distracted, and the serpent sheds its skin, a living symbol of renewal that humans cannot claim. Gilgamesh returns home with nothing he can hold in his hands, but he returns with wisdom. He looks at the walls of Uruk, the city itself, and he realizes that human immortality is not personal endless life. It is legacy. It is what you build. It is the memory your name leaves behind in stone, in story in the lives of others. This is not a cheerful worldview. It's honest. It's heavy. And it matches what Mesopotamian religion often suggests about the afterlife. The underworld is not paradise. It is not reward. It is not moral balance. It is a shadow realm where the dead exist in dimness, sustained by offerings from the living if their descendants remember them. Which means remembrance becomes everything. To be forgotten is to vanish completely. So writing in this context becomes more than administration. It becomes survival in another form. A name pressed into clay can outlast a body. A story copied by generations can keep someone alive in cultural memory long after their bones turn to dust. This is why scribes and libraries matter so much in Mesopotamia. A tablet is small, but it can carry a life across centuries. And it's also why these myths put so much weight on ritual. Because in a world where gods need offerings, ritual is not symbolic. Ritual is function. It keeps the relationship alive. In a typical temple, daily life is structured like a service schedule that never ends. The divine statue is washed, dressed, fed, given music, given incense, given attention. The statue is treated like the god, not because people are pretending, but because the divine presence is believed to inhabit the crafted form. That belief shapes everything. If the god statue is carried off in war, the city is not just looted. The city is spiritually captured. If the statue is damaged, the god is injured. If the rituals fail, the city becomes vulnerable. So religion is not separate from survival. It is woven into economics, politics, health, and warfare. And warfare is constant. City-states fight over water, land canals, trade routes, prestige. They ally and betray and ally again. They raise walls. They build armies. They take captives. They bring home trophies. And every victory is framed as divine favour. Every defeat is framed as divine abandonment or punishment, which gives rulers a powerful narrative tool. If you win, your god is strong. If you lose your city, failed in devotion, or the enemy god temporarily prevailed. This framework makes the gods present in every human action. Farming becomes participation in cosmic order. Law becomes divine alignment. War becomes sacred contest. And yet, despite all this divine weight, the texts also preserve a surprising truth. The gods are not perfect. They panic. They regret. They hunger. They fight among themselves. They make decisions that later look like mistakes. This makes them feel less like untouchable cosmic equations and more like personalities, enormous forces with emotions. It also makes the world feel unstable, because if the gods can regret a flood, then the future is not fixed. It depends on choices, on conflict, on persuasion, on the strange balance between authority and mercy. That balance becomes even more complicated as cultures blend, because Sumerian traditions do not stay isolated. Akkadian-speaking peoples live alongside Sumerians for centuries. Their languages mix. Their gods merge and take on new names. Their myths are translated, adapted, reshaped. And eventually new political centres rise, and with them new divine priorities. A god that was once minor can become supreme if the city that worships him becomes dominant. Which means mythology becomes a living system, not a frozen set of stories. It shifts with power, with empire, with cultural exchange. And that is how you can move from one set of divine politics to another, from Enlil-centered authority to later traditions where different gods, different names, and different cosmic stories begin taking center stage. Not because anyone erased the old myths, but because the world kept changing. And in Mesopotamia, change never fully replaces the past. It layers over it like new buildings built on the foundations of old ones, turning ruins into mounds and mounds into the kind of places where clay tablets can sleep under sand for thousands of years, waiting for someone else in another age to bring them back into the light. When power shifts in Mesopotamia, the gods shift with it. Not because people stop believing in the old deities overnight, and not because temples suddenly empty. It's more subtle than that. Titles change. Names slide into new languages. A god who once stood at the centre becomes one voice among many. Another rises carrying the prestige of a growing city and the political weight of a new empire. It's like watching a skyline change over centuries. The old ziggurats still stand, but new ones rise beside them, and the rituals begin to echo in slightly different accents. One of the biggest turning points is the moment when Akkadian power consolidates. For generations, Akkadian speakers had lived alongside Sumerian speakers, trading, intermarrying, working in the same cities. The languages were different, but the landscape was shared. That meant culture was shared too. And when Akkadian rulers gained control, they didn't erase Sumerian tradition, they absorbed it. Sumerian remained a language of learning and ritual in many contexts, even as Akkadian became the language of administration and daily governance. Priests and scribes continued to train on old texts. Temples continued their routines. The myths continued to be copied, but now translations and bilingual teaching tools became essential. This is one reason Mesopotamian myth survives as well as it does. It was constantly being taught, not casually but formally, in schools, in temple systems, in royal archives, and one of the earliest and most striking examples of this blended literary world is the work of Enheduana. She is remembered as a high priestess, and also as a named author, someone whose voice survives in hymns. Her poems are devotional and political, at once full of emotion and authority. They praise a goddess with intense power, and they also reinforce a regime's legitimacy. The content matters, but the fact of her authorship matters too. A named voice, a person stepping forward from the ancient world, not just as a character in a myth, but as someone who writes. This tells you what kind of society Mesopotamia is becoming. Writing is no longer only for accounting. It is also for persuasion, for identity, for public memory. And as political centres change, theology changes with them. One of the most dramatic examples is Babylon. At first, Babylon is not the centre of everything. It is one city among many. But as it grows in political importance, its patron deity grows too. Marduk rises. And when Marduk rises, the cosmic story begins to rearrange itself around him. This is where the Babylonian creation epic becomes so important. Not because it wipes out older myths, but because it reframes them. It takes familiar themes and retools them for a new hierarchy. The story begins with primal waters deep and undifferentiated, fresh water and salt water, a mingling that produces the first gods. The early divine world is crowded, noisy, restless, and again noise becomes a trigger. The older generation is disturbed by the younger generation's energy. Conflict rises, a plot forms, violence follows, the cosmic family fractures. This kind of story does two things at once. It explains why the world contains order and chaos, and it provides a mythic precedent for political struggle. Power in Mesopotamia is rarely smooth. It is contested, inherited, seized, defended. In the epic, the conflict escalates until a great battle becomes inevitable. A monstrous force is raised. An army forms. Fate itself is symbolized by a tablet that grants authority the ability to decree what will happen. The younger gods are frightened. They hesitate. They look for someone strong enough, daring enough, clever enough to face the threat. And then Marduk steps forward. This is the moment of negotiation. Marduk does not simply volunteer, he sets terms. If he wins, he becomes king of the gods. The others agree because fear makes compromise easy. Marduk arms himself with divine weapons, winds, storm, net, lightning. He faces the prime threats in a battle that reads like a mythic stormfront colliding with the sea itself. He wins, and after he wins, he does something that establishes the pattern for Mesopotamian cosmic thinking. He creates order out of defeated chaos. He shapes the universe. He sets constellations. He organizes time. He establishes the calendar. He defines cosmic boundaries. In other words, creation is not gentle. It is the result of conflict, of victory, of carving structure into raw potential. And then comes the familiar next step. Humans are created to serve. But in this Babylonian framing, the material of human creation is slightly different. Humans are made from the blood of a condemned figure associated with rebellion. That detail is not a small flourish. It becomes a theological explanation for human nature. Why are humans restless? Why are humans disobedient? Why do humans keep pushing against limits? Because rebellion is in the blood. It's a harsh explanation, but it's also consistent with the way these myths treat humans. Humans are necessary, but humans are also a problem. And you can feel how this would resonate in an empire that needs labour obedience and stability. If humans are naturally rebellious, then strict rule is justified as cosmic necessity. That is how myth becomes political logic. And in Babylon, this logic is not confined to texts, it is performed. The creation story is recited during major ritual cycles. The king participates in ceremonies that reaffirm divine order. The city becomes a stage where cosmic hierarchy is rehearsed in public life. This is why Mesopotamian religion is so powerful. It does not sit in private belief. It is enacted, it is embodied, it is repeated until it becomes the rhythm of existence. But even as Babylonian tradition elevates Marduk, the older stories remain alive. Scribes continue to copy Sumerian myths. Priests continue to learn the old language for ritual. The older divine figures keep their places even if the ranking shifts. This creates a layered religious world where multiple versions of cosmic order coexist, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in tension. And that layered world spills outward, because Mesopotamia is not isolated. It's connected to neighbouring cultures through trade war, migration and diplomacy. Texts, ideas and story patterns travel. One of the clearest examples is the flood story. It appears in multiple forms across Mesopotamian tradition. Different names for the flood hero, different details, different emphases, but the same core structure: a divine decision, a warning, a vessel, a cataclysm, a sacrifice, a new arrangement of life afterward. And over time, that structure influences other cultures' storytelling, especially in the ancient Near East, where people are already familiar with floods, with rivers that can become violent, with the idea that water can erase settlements quickly. When a story fits the landscape emotionally, it spreads easily. But even when myths spread, Mesopotamia continues developing its own internal complexity. And one of the most striking developments is the rise of scholarly tradition. Not just scribes writing contracts, but scribes building systems of knowledge, lexical lists, dictionaries, bilingual teaching tablets, Omen catalogues, astronomical records, medical compilations, legal precedents. The city becomes a machine that produces knowledge, and the temple becomes a library as much as a sanctuary. This is where you start to see the Mesopotamian mind at full power, because these people are not only telling stories, they are measuring the world. They track the moon. They record planetary movements. They notice patterns in eclipses. They develop numerical systems capable of handling complex calculations. They build tables of multiplication and division. They solve geometry problems. They track commodity flows across years. They write down symptoms and treatments. They create lists of plants, animals, stones, metals. It's a civilization that wants to categorize reality. And in their worldview, knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge is sacred. Wisdom belongs to the gods, especially gods associated with intelligence, writing and craft. So when scribes learn, they are not simply becoming skilled workers, they are stepping into a divine domain. They are caretakers of cosmic order. This is why myths and scholarship intertwine. The same society that produces epics and hymns produces omen manuals and astronomical logs. The same scribal training that teaches a student how to copy a hymn also teaches him how to calculate an area of a field and how to interpret a strange mark on a sheep's liver. Divination becomes part of governance. Kings consult omen readers before war. Temple experts interpret celestial events. Even weather patterns are watched not only as practical concerns, but as signs. And the belief behind divination is simple but powerful. The universe is not random. The gods communicate. Signs are messages. If you know how to read, you can glimpse divine intention. That idea is deeply appealing in a world where life is precarious, where harvests can fail, where disease can spread, where war can arrive suddenly. Divination offers a feeling of structure. It gives people a way to respond. Even if fate is heavy, there is still action available. Perform rituals. Offer sacrifices. Make corrections. Avoid the wrong day. Delay a campaign. Appease a deity. In this sense, Mesopotamian religion doesn't erase agency. It frames agency as negotiation with powerful forces. And this brings us to a different kind of story. A story that is not about cosmic beginnings, but about daily survival in a world where gods are everywhere. Because once civilization is established, the mythic world does not retreat. It sits inside ordinary life. A farmer opening a canal gate is participating in divine work. A merchant stamping a seal is invoking sacred authority. A judge hearing a case is aligning human conflict with cosmic order. A mother giving birth is entering a space that gods and demons both might touch. And in that daily world, the boundary between the practical and the supernatural is thin. A headache might be bad water, or it might be a ghost. A fever might be infection, or it might be a curse. A string of unlucky days might be coincidence, or it might be divine displeasure. So people live with constant layers of explanation. They treat illness with herbs and bandages, and also with incantations. They protect a house with locks and walls, and also with amulets. They make business deals with contracts and witnesses, and also with prayers. This mixture is not confusion. It's a coherent worldview built for uncertainty. And it means that when you ask what happens in the world after the great cosmic stories, the answer is not simply cities exist. The answer is that a complete culture exists. A culture of writing, a culture of ritual, a culture of law, a culture of trade, a culture of war and diplomacy, a culture of learning, calculation, observation and story. And within that culture the gods remain present as personalities and as principles, which sets the stage for something that becomes increasingly central as time passes. The attempt to preserve everything, not only grain in storehouses, but memory in libraries. Because in Mesopotamia, to lose memory is to lose civilization. And the people who understand that most deeply are the ones pressing signs into clay, one wedge at a time, building a record that can survive Fireclap's conquest and centuries of sand. There's a strange irony in the way Mesopotamian memory survives. Stone crumbles, wood rots, paper burns, but clay, the simplest material in the world, can outlast empires. A tablet can be small enough to fit in your palm, yet it can carry a legal decision, a prayer, a royal boast, or a myth that took centuries to evolve. And when you picture those ancient libraries, you have to imagine something that feels both ordinary and sacred at the same time. Shelves, baskets, stacks of clay rectangles drying in the air. Rooms filled not with silence but with movement and routine, because a library in Mesopotamia isn't only a place to admire knowledge, it's a place where knowledge is produced, checked, copied and used. This is the heartbeat of the scribal world. A scribe is not just a writer. A scribe is a technician of civilization. He can calculate, categorize, record and preserve. He can formalize agreements. He can translate speech into permanent symbols. He can store meaning the way a granary stores barley. And that power shapes everything. Because once you can store information reliably, you can build systems that are bigger than any one person. You can run a temple economy that feeds thousands. You can enforce a law code consistently across neighborhoods. You can manage trade across distances. You can schedule labor for canal maintenance. You can track debts over years, not days. Writing is what allows a city to become truly complex, which means the scribal school is one of the most important institutions in Mesopotamia. And if you could step inside one, it would not feel like a calm, scholarly retreat. It would feel strict, repetitive, exhausting. Students begin with the basics, pressing the same signs again and again, until their hands learn the motion automatically. Their early tablets are practice boards filled with lines of repeated wedges, then short word lists, then longer lists of objects and professions and animals. Many of these lists survive, and they aren't glamorous, but they reveal something crucial. Mesopotamians believed knowledge could be organized. If you can list the world, you can control the world. If you can name things, you can manage them. Once a student advances, they move into more serious texts, hymns, proverbs, legal formulas, classic literature. And copying isn't simply memorization. Copying is preservation. A text lives because it is rewritten. A student's education is a pipeline into administration, temple service, royal work or scholarship. Literacy is a gate. It separates the elite from the majority. It creates a class of people who can shape reality by writing it down. But the scribal world isn't just about formal learning. It's also about the physical experience of writing. Clay is forgiving while it's wet. You can smooth it. You can correct errors. You can reshape it. But once it dries, it becomes permanent. So every tablet carries the tension of skill and consequence. Every line is pressed with intention because mistakes can become part of the record. And records matter, especially when cities change hands. Mesopotamia is a land of conquest, and conquest does not only seize land, it seizes archives. A new ruler wants to understand the economy. He wants to know who owes what, who controls which fields, which temple owns which herds, which merchants hold which contracts, which families have which obligations. An archive is power, so tablets are not only historical artifacts, they are tools in real time. And as centuries pass, certain rulers become famous not just for war, but for collecting and preserving texts. This is where the great royal libraries appear. A king might commission scribes to gather tablets from across the kingdom, or to produce fresh copies of ancient works, not only because he values literature, but because he understands prestige. Knowledge signals legitimacy. A ruler who knows the old traditions can present himself as the rightful heir of civilization itself, even if his dynasty is new. And that desire to connect to ancient authority becomes especially intense in a region where tradition carries sacred weight. Mesopotamia constantly looks backward. The first city is revered. The oldest temple plan is treated like a blueprint that must be restored. Kings describe their building projects as renewals, not innovations. Even when they introduce new methods, they frame them as returning to what the gods originally intended. This is conservative, but it's also strategic. It ties present authority to divine precedent. Now, while archives grow and traditions layer, there's another force shaping how Mesopotamians experience their world. Fear. Not the dramatic fear of a battlefield, but the quiet fear of invisible causes. Because for many people, life is filled with threats that don't have obvious explanations. A child dies suddenly. A fever spreads. A harvest fails. A house collapses. A marriage produces no sons. A merchant caravan disappears. These things could be bad luck. But in Mesopotamian thought, bad luck often means something is wrong in the relationship between humans and the divine. So people search for causes. Was a god offended? Was a ritual performed incorrectly? Was an oath broken? Did an enemy use sorcery? Did a ghost return because the dead were neglected? This is why protective magic becomes a normal part of life. Not fringe behaviour, normal. People wear amulets. They place protective figures near doorways. They recite incantations. They consult specialists. And these specialists are not always viewed as criminals. Many are temple trained, officially recognised experts. There is a difference between authorised ritual work and secret harmful sorcery. The authorised practitioner protects. The secret sorcerer attacks. But both operate in the same conceptual universe. Words have power. Symbols have power. Ritual has power. If you can name an evil force, you can confront it. If you can bind it with a formula, you can push it away. If you can offer the correct sacrifice, you can shift divine attention. This belief gives people something priceless, a sense that they are not completely helpless. And this same logic drives divination. Divination is not entertainment, it is decision-making technology. If the gods communicate through signs, then reading those signs is a survival skill. A ruler wants to know if a campaign will succeed. A family wants to know if an illness will pass. A merchant wants to know if a journey will be safe. A city wants to know if the coming year will be fertile. So they consult omen readers. Some signs come from the sky. Eclipses, strange alignments, unusual weather events. Others come from sacrificial animals, especially the liver, because the liver is viewed as a map where divine intention can be read. The methods can seem strange to modern eyes, but within the world view it makes sense. The gods govern reality. Reality produces patterns. Patterns can be interpreted. And once you accept that the universe becomes readable, it becomes a text. Now here's where things get even more interesting, because this obsession with signs turns Mesopotamia into a society of recorders. They do not only write down myths, they write down observations. They compile catalogues. They create reference works. They preserve interpretations. An omen becomes meaningful only if its meaning is remembered. So a catalogue is created. If this sign appears, then this outcome follows. If that pattern repeats, then that event will occur. This is what makes Mesopotamian scholarship so impressive. It's systematic. It's cumulative. It builds over generations. Astronomers track the sky for centuries. Mathematicians refine calculations. Healers compile symptoms and remedies. Scribes preserve lists of words and meanings. It is slow science, but it is science in the sense that it values observation, pattern, and consistency, and it produces lasting innovations. The base 60 system becomes part of their mathematics. It shapes time division and angles. Their tables allow complex calculations. Their geometry solves practical problems like surveying and construction. Their astronomy becomes predictive. They don't only record the sky, they forecast. And all of it is embedded in the divine framework. Knowledge is not separate from religion. Knowledge is an expression of order. Now let's shift to another layer of daily life that often gets overlooked: trade. Mesopotamia is rich in agricultural potential, but poor in raw materials that other regions take for granted. Stone is scarce. Timber is limited. Metals must be imported, so trade becomes essential. Merchants move goods across long distances, sometimes over land, sometimes along river routes, sometimes through the Persian Gulf. And these journeys are dangerous. Bandits weather political instability, disease. Yet trade continues because the cities cannot function without it. Copper and tin feed bronze production. Timber supports roofing and ships. Stone enables sculpture and durable monuments. Luxury goods signal prestige and divine favour. This is why merchant culture grows. Contracts, partnerships, loans, insurance-like agreements. These things become normal in the documents. Writing makes it possible to track trade in a sophisticated way. You can record a shipment. You can enforce repayment. You can formalize an investment. And because the temple and palace systems often control major economic operations, trade is not always private. It can be institutional, directed by powerful organizations that behave like enormous corporations. Yet private merchants still exist, and they sometimes become wealthy enough to shape city life. This economic complexity feeds into social complexity. People aren't all doing the same thing. There are specialized crafts weaving pottery, metalwork, brewing, carpentry, seal carving. A city becomes a network of professions, and that means identity becomes tied to labor. In Mesopotamian texts, professions are often listed and ranked. Occupation is part of social position. A scribe stands differently than a farmer. A priest stands differently than a potter. A soldier stands differently than a herdsman. And over all of them stands the king who claims divine mandate. But the king's power is not absolute in a simple way. He must maintain relationships with temples, elites, military forces, and the gods themselves as represented by priesthood and ritual obligations, which creates constant negotiation inside the city. Now add one more pressure: environmental fragility. Mesopotamia relies on irrigation, and irrigation has consequences. Water can bring salts up into the soil. Over time, fields can become less productive. If canals aren't managed properly, land can become waterlogged, then ruined. This means the system that creates civilization also contains the seeds of long-term crisis. And the texts reflect that anxiety. They contain laments about ruined cities. They contain prayers for protection. They contain ritual instructions designed to keep disasters away. They contain historical accounts of floods and droughts and political collapse. Mesopotamians know their world can break. And that knowledge makes them cling to order, to ritual, to law, to writing, to the idea that if you maintain the correct patterns, you can hold chaos at bay. This is why when a city falls, the fall is described as more than military defeat. It is cosmic disturbance. It means the god has withdrawn. It means the city's protective order has been shattered. And it's in those moments when the world feels unstable that the need to preserve memory becomes even stronger. Because if everything can collapse, then the one thing you can fight for is continuity. A tablet copy today might be read generations later. A hymn can carry a city's identity beyond its walls. A king's inscription can project authority even after the palace is rubble. And that brings us to the central paradox of Mesopotamian civilization. It is fragile, but it is persistent. It can be conquered, but it can adapt. Languages shift, but the myth patterns survive. Dynasties end, but rituals continue. Cities fall, but their stories are copied elsewhere. And because of that persistence, the clay record becomes enormous. Hundreds of thousands of tablets, receipts, laws, letters, omen texts, medical notes, myths, prayers, songs, personal complaints, administrative lists. Everything that a civilization produces when it learns how to make thought permanent. And in the midst of this ocean of clay, the divine figures remain not as distant abstractions, but as constant presences in the logic of the society. Enlil as authority and discipline, Enki as wisdom and creative problem solving, Ainana as power, ambition, desire, conflict, Nina Sag as fertility and birth, Shamash as justice, Sin as time and night light, and the endless smaller gods, spirits, demons and ghosts that fill the invisible world. This is not a tidy religion. It's a living ecosystem, and the people inside it are constantly negotiating with it, shaping their lives around it, writing it down, copying it, preserving it, trying to keep the world stable in a land where rivers can shift course and history can change direction in a single generation. Now imagine you're walking into a Mesopotamian city on an ordinary day, not a festival day, not a royal parade, just a normal morning when the sun is already bright, the air is warm, and the streets are waking up like a living thing. The first thing you notice is the smell. Mud brick holds heat and dust. Cooking fires add smoke. Beer brewing adds a sour sweetness. Animals are everywhere, not in a neat separate area, but woven into daily life. Goats, sheep, donkeys, dogs wandering around looking for scraps, birds circling above. Then you hear the sound of water. Not a gentle stream, but canals, ditches, small channels cut into the earth and lined with mud and reeds. Water is controlled here like a nervous system. It flows where it is allowed to flow. If it flows wrong, everything collapses. You pass a canal bank where men are working with tools scraping silt, reinforcing a wall, digging deeper. They're not doing this because they feel inspired. They're doing it because the city depends on it. And the city knows it depends on it. This is why labour isn't just an economic matter. Labour is civic duty. It's also sacred duty. Keeping the water moving the right way is keeping order alive. A city is a machine powered by irrigation. Now move deeper into the streets. Houses cluster tightly built to share walls and save space. Many homes are built around inner courtyards because that's where air can move, where you can get shade, where cooking and washing can happen out of public view. If you step into one, you'll see something familiar and something strange. Familiar family life. Children playing, chasing each other, being yelled at, being pulled away from danger, being handed small tasks, because childhood here isn't a long protected phase. It's training for survival. Strange the sense that the divine is integrated into the home. Household rituals, small figurines, protective symbols, offerings, words spoken quietly, not for show, but because people believe unseen forces listen. When a family eats, it is not purely a private moment. It is also part of a larger cosmic ecosystem. Now picture the marketplace. This is where the city's energy becomes visible. People bargaining, merchants laying out goods, weavers selling cloth, potters stacking bowls, metal workers offering tools and jewellery, farmers bringing produce, fish sellers calling out. And at the edges, you might see officials not in shining uniforms, but in practical clothes, watching, recording, collecting fees, keeping order. Because the city is always being measured. Even ordinary trade can generate obligations, taxes, temple payments, debts. This is why the idea of writing matters so much. A verbal agreement can be denied. A written tablet can be enforced. So the market is not only economic, it is legal. You can feel the presence of bureaucracy in the background like a shadow. And now rise above the market noise and look toward the centre. Every major Mesopotamian city is built around a sacred core, the temple complex. Even if you've never seen one, you can sense it from the outside. Walls, gates, courtyards, people moving in and out, storage rooms, administrative buildings, workshops, animal pens. The temple is not only worship, it is production. Textiles are made here, food is stored here, beer is brewed here, land is managed here, wages are distributed here. Temple economies employ huge numbers of people. That means the temple is a social anchor. If you work for the temple, you receive rations. You have stability. And at the heart of this complex, higher and more imposing is the ziggurat, a stepped mountain built by human hands. It rises from the flat land like a statement, not only of power, of connection. The ziggurat is a bridge concept, a vertical axis that suggests the gods aren't far away in some abstract heaven. They are reachable. They have an address. But only certain people can approach closely. Most worshippers remain in outer courtyards. They pray, offer gifts, participate in public rituals. The inner sanctum is different. It is controlled, restricted, cleaned, protected. Because in Mesopotamian belief, the statue inside the temple is not a symbolic decoration. It is the god's presence. This is the part that can feel so surprising if you grew up with a different religious worldview. The statue is washed, dressed, fed and honoured because the god is understood to be there. And the ritual schedule is strict. Morning offerings, midday prayers, evening rituals, night sealing. This rhythm turns the temple into something like a living household where the deity is treated as the most important resident. Now zoom out again, because if the temple is the sacred heart, the palace is the political heart. Many cities have a palace complex that functions as the king's household, the administration centre, and the military coordination hub. The king's legitimacy is tied to the gods, and that legitimacy must be performed constantly. He sponsors temple building. He offers sacrifices. He commissions inscriptions. He frames victories as divine approval. But a king also has to manage practical matters, labour organisation, defence, diplomacy, court disputes. Which brings us to law. The law in Mesopotamia is not just philosophical, it is concrete, it is recorded, it is enforced. Disputes over property, inheritance, marriage contracts, loans, damaged goods, injuries, theft. A huge portion of surviving tablets are basically the paperwork of daily conflict resolution. This tells you something important about civilization. Civilization is not only art and architecture. Civilization is conflict managed through systems, and those systems are written down. A marriage, for instance, is not just an emotional union. It's a contract between families with economic implications, dowries, obligations, and conditions for divorce. A loan is not casual, it has terms. A business partnership is formal. Even adoption can be documented to secure inheritance arrangements. And because all of this is recorded, society becomes more predictable but also more controlled. Now let's shift to something darker, because daily life includes fear, and that fear shapes behaviour. Illness is everywhere. There are genuine medical practitioners who use herbs, salves, procedures, and practical techniques. But there are also ritual specialists, because illness is often interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or supernatural attack. So treatment becomes layered. You might apply a remedy and recite an incantation. You might set a bone and consult an omen. You might care for a fevered child while also placing protective objects in the room to block malevolent forces. From the inside, this isn't confusion, it's comprehensive care. People are doing everything they can with the tools they believe are available. And then there is death. Death is not romanticised. It is feared not only because of pain, but because of what comes after. The underworld is not a place of reward. It is bleak. Shadows, dust, hunger, forgetting. The best defence against that is remembrance. If you have descendants who pour libations at your grave and say your name, you have a thin thread of connection to the living world. If you are forgotten, it's like you vanish twice. So family becomes essential. Children become essential. Burial becomes essential. This is why proper funerary practice matters so much. And this is also why ghosts matter. A neglected dead person can return not as a comforting spirit, but as a problem. A restless ghost is a cause of illness, nightmares, misfortune. So rituals exist to appease the dead, to send them away, to keep boundaries intact. Again, you see the theme: boundaries must be maintained. Between water and land, between city and wilderness, between living and dead, between human and divine. Now add the constant reality of conflict between cities. Because while the streets may feel normal today, the political world is unstable. City-states compete for canals, trade routes, prestige. They raid, they siege, they negotiate, they betray, they ally. War is never far away. And war is justified theologically. A victory means your God favoured you. A defeat means your God withdrew, or the enemy's God temporarily dominated. This interpretation does something powerful. It turns politics into cosmic drama. It makes history feel meaningful even when it's brutal. And it also creates a strange kind of flexibility. A conquered city's God is not necessarily destroyed. The statue might be taken away, showing the god has been captured. The Pantheon absorbs defeated deities at lower rank. This makes Mesopotamian religion adaptable. It can expand. It can incorporate new gods. It can reshape hierarchies, which is one reason it lasts so long. Now here's the moment where everything ties together. All these daily practices, labour, trade, law, ritual, divination, medicine, war, family, death, are not seen as separate categories. They are seen as one integrated system. A person in Mesopotamia does not wake up thinking, now I'll do secular life and later I'll do religion. Religion is not a separate room. It is the architecture of reality. The gods govern the waters. The gods grant fertility. The gods decide fates. The gods protect cities. The gods determine victory. Humans respond with work offerings, obedience, and constant attention to signs. And that attention becomes the mechanism through which culture is preserved. Because what does a scribe do in this world? A scribe records the structure of the system. And once the system is recorded, it can be replicated. A ritual can be performed correctly in a different century because the instructions survive. A law can be enforced consistently because the formula survives. A myth can be retold with authority because the tablet survives. This is how a civilization becomes durable. Not because it never collapses, but because it knows how to rebuild using memory. A city burns, but someone copies its hymns elsewhere. A dynasty ends, but its administrative practices are adopted by the next ruler. A language declines, but scribes keep it alive as a scholarly tongue. And underneath all of that, the same divine framework continues to pulse. A society can change rulers, borders and languages, yet keep the same sacred logic. That's why when you step into this imagined city, what you're really stepping into is a worldview where order is fragile, and the greatest duty is to maintain it through ritual, labour, law and record keeping. Because the alternative is chaos, and chaos is always waiting just outside the walls. Now let's zoom in on something the Mesopotamians cared about just as much as water and grain. Knowledge. Not knowledge as a hobby, not knowledge as trivia. Knowledge as power that keeps the world from sliding into disorder. Because in their worldview, civilization is not automatic. It's not guaranteed. It's not something you can take for granted. It's a structure that has to be held in place every day, like a roof beam that will sag if nobody checks it. And the way you hold it in place is by doing things correctly. Correct rituals, correct measurements, correct timing, correct words, correct records. That's why so many of their stories aren't just entertainment. They're also explanations. They're teaching tools. They're memory systems. A Mesopotamian myth often sounds like drama on the surface. Gods arguing and scheming and punishing and rescuing. But under the surface, it's also showing you how society works, why it works, and what happens when it breaks. One of the clearest examples of that is the idea that civilization has rules, not just human rules, but cosmic rules. In some traditions, those rules are described as a set of divine principles, sometimes called the me. Think of them like the operating codes of culture. Not only big ideas like kingship and justice, but also practical and social realities, craftsmanship, music, writing, sexual relations, trade festivals, warfare, temple service, even the etiquette of speech. The Emi are not just inventions, they're treated as ancient foundational, like the blueprint that makes a city possible. And one of the most fascinating myth patterns in this world is how those principles move, because they're not simply handed down politely. Sometimes they're stolen. Sometimes they're negotiated. Sometimes they're taken through cleverness. This is where a figure like Inanna becomes so important. She's not gentle. She's not passive. She's ambitious, bold, and disruptive. She represents the kind of force that doesn't wait for permission. In stories, she goes to the realm of wisdom, gets the divine principles, and carries them to her city. The result is that her city becomes a cultural and political powerhouse. From a modern perspective, it can look like chaos, but from a Mesopotamian perspective, it explains something real, why some cities become centres of power and culture, why influence shifts, why one place suddenly thrives. It wraps political reality in divine narrative. And it does something else. It teaches that knowledge is valuable enough to fight over. Now bring that down to the level of everyday life. If you're a farmer, knowledge looks like timing, water management, planting cycles, field boundaries, seed ratios, storage techniques. If you're a builder, knowledge looks like brick making geometry, load distribution, ramps, foundations. If you're a merchant, knowledge looks like weights and measures, contracts, interest rates, credit arrangements, trade routes. If you're a priest, Knowledge looks like hymns, purification rituals, calendar calculations, offerings, omen interpretation. If you're a king, knowledge looks like administration, diplomacy, military strategy, labour, organisation, law enforcement, propaganda. And if you're a scribe, knowledge looks like everything, because the scribe is the one who turns a living system into a permanent record. This is why scribal education is such a big deal. A scribe is not simply a person who can read and write. A scribe is an elite technician, a trained mind. Learning cuneiform is hard. You're not learning an alphabet of a couple dozen letters. You're learning a huge system of signs that can represent sounds, words, categories, and abstract ideas depending on context. So the scribal school becomes a pressure cooker. It's strict. It's repetitive. It's exhausting. It's meant to reshape the student's brain. And the students copy and copy and copy. Lists of signs, lists of objects, lists of professions, lists of animals, lists of cities, then phrases, then proverbs, then hymns and myths. Not because they're trying to be poetic, but because this is how a culture trains people to preserve itself. A society can survive instability if it can preserve its knowledge systems. And scribes are the hard drives. What makes this even more interesting is that scribal training blends practical skills with sacred content. A student doesn't only learn how to write a receipt, they learn how to write a hymn. They don't only learn how to calculate barley rations, they learn the names and titles of gods. They don't only learn how to measure a field, they learn the stories that explain why fields matter. So the mental world of the educated class becomes a combined space where economy, religion, law and myth all reinforce each other. Now let's talk about math, because this is one of the places where Mesopotamian genius still touches your daily life without you realizing. They developed a base 60 system. That choice shaped timekeeping. It shaped geometry. It shaped the way later cultures calculated angles and cycles. This is why a circle is divided into 360 degrees. This is why an hour has 60 minutes. This is why a minute has 60 seconds. These numbers aren't random. They're echoes of Mesopotamian calculation methods. And their math wasn't only basic counting. They worked with fractions. They used tables. They solved problems that involve areas, volumes, and ratios. They trained students using problem tablets that look in spirit like modern math exercises. A teacher gives a scenario. The student solves it. The method is taught through repetition and pattern recognition. And the purpose is practical surveying, land dividing, inheritance, planning construction, managing storage. Math is not abstract in this world. Math is how you keep the grain system from collapsing. Now pair math with astronomy. Mesopotamian societies track the sky with obsessive attention, not because they were dreamy stargazers, but because timekeeping controlled everything. When to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals, when to perform specific rituals, when a king should launch a campaign, when a negative omen might require delay. So the sky is not just beautiful, it's a clock. It's also a message board. People watch the moon's phases, the sun's path, the appearance of planets. They record unusual events, eclipses, strange weather, unexpected celestial alignments. Over centuries, those records become a tradition of prediction. This is one of the reasons Babylonian astronomical practice becomes legendary later. But again, to understand it properly, don't imagine modern astronomy separated from belief. For them, astronomy is part of divine communication. The universe is ordered. The gods placed patterns, and those patterns can be read. That belief makes careful observation sacred work. Now add law. Mesopotamian legal thinking is practical, detailed, and deeply tied to social hierarchy. Laws define consequences. They set fines. They assign responsibilities. They attempt to stabilize relationships between classes, between families, between employers and workers, between buyers and sellers. But the law is also presented as morally serious. It's not just a list of punishments. It's a way to claim legitimacy. A king who produces a law code is telling his people and rival cities that he is the kind of ruler who can maintain order. He is aligning himself with divine justice. This is why law codes often begin with grand statements about the king being chosen by the gods to establish fairness and protect the vulnerable. Whether that fairness is perfectly applied is another story. But the claim matters, because the claim is part of the structure. Now step back and let the pattern become visible. Knowledge in Mesopotamia moves through systems. The temple system preserves ritual knowledge. The palace system preserves administrative knowledge. The scribal schools preserve written techniques and cultural memory. The myths preserve worldview and justification. The math and astronomy preserve predictability. The law preserves enforceable expectations, and all of it is framed within a story about divine origin. That framing does something powerful. It makes human effort feel meaningful. A person who digs a canal isn't merely digging a ditch. He's maintaining order. A scribe isn't merely writing a tablet. He's preserving the foundation of civilization. A priest isn't merely reciting words. He's keeping the city aligned with cosmic reality. Even a merchant moving goods from far away becomes part of the system that keeps the city alive. Because if the trade stops, materials stop. If materials stop, production stops. If production stops, power weakens. If power weakens, enemies attack. If enemies attack, the temples are damaged. If the temples are damaged, the god's presence is threatened. You can see how everything connects, and that's the key point. After the gods are said to have shaped the world and established the order, life becomes a constant maintenance job. Not maintenance in a boring way, maintenance in a life or death way. This worldview produces people who are extremely sensitive to disruption and extremely devoted to routines, because routines are what stand between civilization and collapse. And when you look at the surviving tablets, you can feel that mentality. There are myths, yes, but there are also lists, accounts, contracts, school exercises, medical notes, omen, interpretations, inventories, letters. It's like listening to a city's heartbeat preserved in clay. And if you listen carefully, you realise something almost haunting. The people who made those tablets were not thinking about fame. They weren't imagining a distant future audience. They were doing their work because their world depended on it, and in doing it, they accidentally created one of humanity's greatest gifts, a civilization that can speak across time. Now let's talk about something that feels almost invisible when you read the myths, but becomes obvious when you look at the civilization behind them. Power. Not just power as violence, but power as structure. Because Mesopotamia didn't just invent writing and cities, it also refined something that would become one of the most influential inventions in human history, organised authority. And in their world, authority wasn't treated like a human convenience. It was treated like something rooted in the divine. That's why kingship is described as if it descends from heaven. It's not phrased like a committee election. It's framed like a cosmic event. The idea is simple. Humans didn't invent the right to rule. The gods established it. The king holds it temporarily, and if the gods withdraw it, the city falls. This concept turns politics into theology and theology into politics. It's a loop. If you're a king, you don't say, I am powerful because I conquered. You say, I conquered because I was chosen. That choice is the source of legitimacy. And legitimacy matters because a city is not held together by walls alone. It's held together by belief. The belief that the system is correct. The belief that the social order is not random. The belief that the gods approve. Now think about what a king actually does in a Sumerian or Babylonian city-state. He supervises labour projects. He organises irrigation. He commands soldiers. He settles disputes. He funds temples. He negotiates treaties. He collects surplus. He redistributes rations. He punishes crime. He sponsors inscriptions. He performs rituals. That's a huge list, and it reveals something important. The king is both manager and symbol. He keeps the machine running, and he represents the city's relationship with the gods. So when a city is prosperous, the king looks blessed. When a city suffers drought or defeat, people don't just blame the weather or bad luck. They ask what went wrong with our relationship to the divine order. And if that relationship is broken, the king's legitimacy is threatened. This is why kings are obsessed with religious performance. Temples are not optional decoration, they're political infrastructure. If the god is satisfied, the city stands. If the god is offended, the city is vulnerable. So kings build and rebuild temples constantly. They lay foundation deposits. They carve their names into bricks. They proclaim that they restored the temple according to ancient divine plans. That phrasing matters because it doesn't present the king as an innovator who creates new things. It presents him as a restorer, a caretaker. In Mesopotamia, to be legitimate is to connect yourself to the most ancient and sacred version of order. Even if you introduce something new, you describe it as recovering something old. Now let's move from the king to the city itself. A Mesopotamian city is not just a dense cluster of houses. It's a network of obligations. Work obligations, tax obligations, ritual obligations, military obligations. The temple system sits at the centre because it manages land and food. The palace system sits alongside because it manages coercion and coordination. And between them, you have a class of officials and scribes who translate the city's life into numbers and tablets. Which means power is not only in swords, power is in records. A tablet can assign labour. A tablet can establish debt. A tablet can confirm property ownership. A tablet can prove you owe grain. A tablet can prove you paid grain. So writing creates a new kind of control. Not necessarily cruel by default, but capable of becoming cruel because it makes obligations permanent. It makes the invisible visible. And once obligations are visible, they can be enforced. This is where social classes become more solid. Mesopotamian societies are stratified. There are elites. There are commoners. There are dependents. There are slaves. There are temple workers and palace workers. There are specialists. There are people with land and people without land. And while the details vary by period and city, the overall pattern is clear. Civilization produces hierarchy. The myth language reflects that hierarchy too. The divine world is a hierarchy of councils, ranks, sacred numbers, offices. The human world is a hierarchy of kings, priests, elders, officials, labourers. The mirror is not accidental. The divine structure is used to justify the human structure. Now here's where it gets interesting, because even within a system that looks rigid, there's movement. People can rise and fall. A merchant can become wealthy. A scribe can become influential. A priest can control resources. A soldier can gain status through victory. Even a person born into difficulty can sometimes change their position through marriage, service, or luck. But the system always frames that movement as something that happens within divine oversight. If you rise, the gods favoured you. If you fall, the gods withdrew favour. This is not just superstition, it's a social logic. It explains inequality in a way that makes the system tolerable. It also reinforces behaviour because if you want stability, you must remain aligned with divine expectation. Now let's shift from power to anxiety because Mesopotamian power structures generate anxiety. Not just fear of enemies, but fear of missteps. If the city is held together by routines and routines keep the gods satisfied, then a mistake becomes dangerous. And that danger is both practical and spiritual. A poorly maintained canal can flood fields. A missed ritual can offend a deity. A broken treaty can provoke war. A bad omen can signal doom. So the culture becomes intensely concerned with signs and procedures. This is where divination becomes central, not as entertainment, but as political technology. Kings consult omens before campaigns. Officials consult omens before projects. Even private citizens consult signs about marriage, illness, business and travel. And the most prestigious kind of divination is the reading of a sacrificed animal's organs, especially the liver. To modernise, that seems strange. But in their worldview, the gods govern fate, and fate leaves traces. If you know how to read those traces, you can act strategically. Divination becomes early risk management. Sometimes the answer is go ahead. Sometimes the answer is delay. Sometimes the answer is perform this ritual to neutralise the threat. So fate is not simply accepted. Fate is negotiated, which means humans have agency, but the agency is expressed through ritual response rather than pure independent decision. Now picture a king learning that an eclipse is a bad sign. He might cancel a campaign. He might appoint a substitute king for a short period, so that if divine punishment falls, it falls on the substitute, not the real ruler. He might intensify rituals to protect the city. These actions sound dramatic because they are, but they show how seriously signs are taken. The universe is seen as a conversation between gods and humans, and the language of that conversation is Omen. Now let's talk about warfare again, because the political world is rarely peaceful for long. City walls are not decorative. They are survival, and siege warfare is brutal. A siege isn't a quick battle and done. It's prolonged hunger, fear, disease, desperation. Inside the walls, people ration food. Outside the walls, armies build ramps or dig tunnels. Both sides watch for weakness. And when a city falls, consequences are severe. Looting, captives, executions, deportations, the removal of divine statues, the public humiliation of defeated rulers, the destruction of temples. This is why cities treat war as sacred drama. If your god statue is taken, it's not only political defeat, it's cosmic defeat. It suggests the god's protection has been compromised. Which is why conquering a city isn't only about taking land, it's about proving divine superiority. And this creates a theological flexibility where new gods can rise with political shifts. If Babylon rises, Marduk rises. If Assyria dominates, Assyrian theology emphasizes their divine patronage. If a city falls, its deity may be subordinated. So religion evolves with power, but the core structure remains. Divine legitimacy, human hierarchy, ritual maintenance. Now bring this back to the Anunnaki concept. In many traditions, the Anunnaki are not a single story with one fixed meaning. They represent the great powers, the divine assembly, the ruling class of the gods. In myth, these beings debate human fate. They create, they punish, they regret, they compromise. And that behaviour mirrors the human ruling class. Councils debating policy, kings issuing decrees, officials enforcing decisions, disputes and compromises. The myth world, and the political world reflect each other like layered glass. Now here's a subtle but crucial point. Even with all this hierarchy, Mesopotamian religion does not portray the gods as perfect. They make mistakes. They disagree. They become frightened. They panic. They regret decisions. They can be deceived. They can be persuaded. This is why myth remains emotionally powerful, because it shows a universe where even divine authority is not completely stable, which means the human world will never be completely stable either. Order is always an achievement, not a default. That belief creates urgency. It creates discipline. It creates ritual obsession. And it also creates room for cleverness. A god like Enki thrives in such a system because he represents the intelligence that keeps life going when authority becomes too harsh. In human terms, he resembles the advisor who prevents the king from making catastrophic choices. He represents adaptability, creativity, solutions that honour rules while bending them. That kind of intelligence is deeply valued in a world where survival depends on getting the system to keep functioning. So when people tell stories about divine councils and human creation and floods and compromises, they are also telling stories about governance, about population control, about the tension between authority and compassion, about what happens when rulers overreact, about the consequences of violent solutions, and about the need for systems that prevent catastrophe. This is why the myths don't feel like distant fantasy when you understand the civilization behind them. They are reflections of lived political reality. Now, one more layer. Even as kings and temples dominate the city's structure, ordinary people still have emotional lives. They still fear loss. They still love. They still grieve. They still celebrate. They still complain. And we know this because tablets preserve personal letters, small messages sent between family members, requests for goods, arguments over debts, worries about health, expressions of frustration. It's one of the most humanizing parts of the Mesopotamian archive. You can almost hear the voice of someone saying, "Why haven't you answered me? Why haven't you sent what you promised? Do you not care?" These voices exist alongside royal propaganda and temple hymns, and they remind you that even under divine hierarchy, people are still people. They still live inside the system, and they still feel it pressing down on them. Which is why the question of what happens after the gods establish civilization is not only a question of grand myths. It's also the question of everyday life under structure. A world where the rivers must be controlled, the temples must be fed, the gods must be honoured, the king must be legitimized, the records must be kept, the omens must be read, and the walls must stand. Because if any of those fail, chaos doesn't wait politely. Chaos comes in like floodwater. Now let's step away from palaces and councils for a minute and walk into a place that doesn't sound dramatic at first, but might be the most important room in the whole civilization. A storeroom, a granary, a temple archive. Because if you want to understand what it felt like to live after the gods established the system, you have to understand how much of life was about counting, storing and distributing. This is the part of Mesopotamia that people don't usually imagine when they picture ancient myths. They imagine ziggurats and priests chanting and kings in gold. But behind that, there's a constant pressure. Food has to be managed. Water has to be managed. Labour has to be managed. And when you look at the surviving tablets, most of them are not myths. Most of them are paperwork. That should tell you something. Civilization runs on administration, and administration runs on trust, or at least on enforceable records that replace trust. So here's the everyday rhythm of a city. Grain comes in after harvest rations go out all year, and everything is tracked. People receive barley rations. They receive oil. They receive wool. They receive beer. Sometimes they receive meat during festivals or special distributions. This is not a modern cash economy. It's a ration and redistribution system in many places and periods, especially within temple and palace networks. So the temple is not only a spiritual centre, it's a logistical centre. It's a giant institution that owns land hires, labour controls, workshops, and organises production. A temple can employ farmers, shepherds, brewers, weavers, potters, brickmakers, boat builders, merchants, scribes, guards, musicians. And the way those employees get paid is often through measured rations recorded on tablets. That means the scribe is sitting right next to power. If you can write the numbers down, you can shape reality. You can confirm what someone is owed. You can deny what someone claims. You can record debts and obligations. You can make a transaction official. In other words, writing becomes a tool of social control, but also social stability. Because without a system like this, disputes explode. People fight over what they deserve. Work collapses. Projects stop. And when projects stop, canals silt up, fields fail, and the city starves. So the boring part, the counting and rationing, is not boring at all. It's the skeleton of the civilization. Now think about how the myths reflect this. Humans are created to do labour. Labour is presented as essential. Work is not romanticised, but it is respected as a necessity. And you can feel a cultural logic behind that myth. Because in the real city, labour is everything. A canal doesn't dig itself. A dike doesn't repair itself. A ziggurat doesn't build itself. A harvest doesn't appear without months of weeding, watering, guarding, and threshing. So a society that survives in that landscape becomes deeply aware that civilization is built by hands. Now let's move from grain to textiles, because textiles are massive in Mesopotamia and they don't always get the attention they deserve. Cloth is a major export. Cloth is wealth. Cloth is currency in practice. Cloth is also employment. Huge numbers of workers, especially women, are involved in spinning and weaving. Temple workshops can run textile production at a large scale. And again, everything is recorded. How much wool went in? How much thread came out? How many finished cloth pieces were delivered? Which worker produced how much? Who supervised? Who received rations? This is not a small cottage industry. This is organised production. And it means that the image of ancient life as simple and unstructured is completely wrong. They are running what looks like early institutional manufacturing. Now add trade, because the river plains are rich in food potential but poor in raw materials. No good building stone, limited timber, limited metal sources. So they import. That means long-distance networks, caravans, boats, ports, middlemen, contracts, insurance arrangements, and again tablets. Writing makes trade scalable. It allows credit agreements, long-distance partnerships. A merchant can borrow silver, travel by, goods sell, return repay with interest. And the contract can define the terms. It's not casual, it's legal. Which means the civilization is generating an early financial system. Not modern, but sophisticated enough to support large projects and international exchange. And trade isn't only economic. It changes culture. When goods move, ideas move. Religious practices influence each other. Art styles blend. Languages borrow terms. Even gods gain new titles or merge with other deities. So the myth world is not a sealed box. It's a living system that adapts as the civilization connects outward. Now let's step into an ordinary home. Mud brick walls. A courtyard. A cooking space. Storage jars. Maybe a small shrine niche for household gods or protective spirits. People start the day early, not because it's romantic, but because heat and work demand it. They eat bread, maybe porridge, dates, if they have them. They drink beer because beer is a safe common beverage. Water can be risky depending on sources. Beer is also calories. Beer is also social. Beer is also ration. Children are everywhere. Not because people are careless, but because infant mortality is high, and families need labour and descendants. A household is not just a sentimental unit, it's economic survival. Everyone contributes. Kids help with smaller tasks early. By early teens, many are effectively adults by modern standards. Now here's a part of Mesopotamian life that is both intimate and revealing letters. We have letters that show frustration, fear, demand, reassurance, a son asking a mother for supplies, a worker complaining about rations, a merchant arguing about payment, a wife reminding her husband of obligations. You can hear the tone across millennia, human voices. And that matters because it shows that the mythic system doesn't erase individual feeling, it sits on top of it. People may believe the gods govern fate, but they still worry about whether their brother will repay a debt. They still grieve when a child dies. They still feel cheated when the distribution is unfair. They still hope for protection. They still fear illness. Now let's talk about illness because it sits right at the crossroads of practical life and supernatural belief. Mesopotamians had physicians who used observation and remedies. They recognized patterns. They used herbs. They treated wounds. They set bones. But they also had exorcists, because many illnesses were interpreted as divine displeasure, demonic attack, or sorcery. So healing becomes both practical and ritual. A person might receive a poultice and an incantation, a treatment and a purification, a diagnosis that includes bodily symptoms and omen interpretation. From the inside, this makes sense. When you live in a world without modern germ theory, illness feels like a message. It arrives unpredictably. It destroys the strong and the weak. It can wipe out children quickly. It can devastate communities. So people search for meaning. And meaning is often expressed through the divine. Now connect that to the idea of the underworld. The Mesopotamian afterlife is not a paradise. It's bleak, shadows, dust, silence. The dead don't become radiant beings. They become a quieter version of themselves. So the focus becomes legacy and remembrance. Being remembered matters. Having descendants matters. Proper burial matters. Offering rituals matter, because those things are believed to provide some stability for the dead. So again, you see the theme. Stability must be maintained, even beyond death. Now let's add another layer of daily life protection. People worry about demons. They worry about curses. They worry about envy. They worry about hostile magic. So they wear amulets. They place protective figures in foundations. They recite incantations. They perform rituals to neutralize evil. This isn't a side hobby. It's part of how they manage fear. It's early psychological defense expressed through the cultural language of spirits and divine forces. If you can't control disease and sudden disaster scientifically, you control it ritually. You create routines. You create protections. You create a sense that you are not helpless. Now step back. When you combine ration systems, temple economies, trade networks, legal contracts, household survival, illness, protection, rituals, and the constant anxiety of river unpredictability, you can understand why Mesopotamian myth is what it is. It's not dreamy fiction. It's a worldview built under pressure. It's a mental framework that tries to answer a daily question: how do we keep order from collapsing? And in that framework, the gods are not distant. They're involved. They own the blueprint. They oversee the system. They can become angry. They can become protective. They can be negotiated with. They can be appeased. They can be tricked. They can be mournful. And humans are not meaningless. Humans are necessary, not only as labourers, but as the keepers of continuity. Because without humans, the temples go silent, the offerings stop, the records stop, the canals decay, the cities crumble, even the gods in the stories suffer when human routines vanish. So the civilization teaches its people in story and in practice that daily maintenance is sacred, that counting grain can be cosmic work, that lighting incense can be civic stability, that copying a tablet can be cultural survival. And that is what life looks like when you live in a world where order is always at risk. Now let's move into the part of the Mesopotamian world that feels the most unfamiliar to modern minds, even though it shaped everything from medicine to politics to war. Omens. Because for the people living in these cities, the universe wasn't silent. It was speaking constantly, not in words, but in signs. A strange birth, a dog entering a temple, a sudden storm, a crack in a wall, a dream that feels too vivid, a star that appears in the wrong place, a liver with an unusual mark. All of these are treated like messages. And if you don't read the messages, you're blind. This is why divination becomes an entire profession, not a fringe thing, a trained craft, because interpreting signs requires memorized catalogues, technical language, ritual skill, and social authority. And once you realize that, you start to see why Mesopotamian power and Mesopotamian fear are so tightly connected. Because if fate is being written by the gods, you need a way to peek at the writing, so you can respond, so you can prepare, so you can negotiate, so you can avoid disaster. Now imagine being a king. You're about to launch a campaign. You're about to attack a rival city. You have to mobilize troops, supplies, boats, siege equipment. That's expensive. If you lose, it's not only your pride, it can destabilize the whole state. So before you move, you consult the gods. But the gods don't show up as a voice in the room. They show up as signs in the world. So you consult diviners. The most prestigious form is reading a sacrificed sheep. The liver is the primary focus because it is believed to reflect the divine decision. The liver becomes a map, a surface where fate has left marks. Diviners trained to recognize dozens of features, shapes, bulges, discolorations, odd forms. Each feature has an interpretation, not a random guess, but a traditional meaning documented in Omen compendiums. If this mark appears victory, if that mark appears defeat. If a certain section is damage, danger to the king. If another section looks strong, protection. Now the obvious modern question is, did it work? But that's not the right question if you want to understand the society. The right question is, what does it do? It creates a sense that the universe is legible. It allows decision-making under uncertainty. It gives leaders a framework for choosing, delaying, or changing strategy. It also gives the priestly and scholarly class enormous influence. Because if you can interpret fate, you can shape policy. And once policy is shaped, the city's direction changes. So divination isn't passive superstition. It's active governance. Now divination doesn't only happen at the top. Ordinary people consult signs too. People want to know if a marriage will be stable, if a child will survive, if a business venture is worth the risk, if a journey is safe, if an illness is a curse. So the universe becomes saturated with meaning. Even small events can be ominous. This produces a certain kind of psychological environment, a world where nothing is neutral, a world where you are always potentially being watched by forces you cannot see, a world where you must remain cautious, respectful, correct. This makes ritual behavior feel practical. Because if the gods communicate through signs, then your behavior can influence what signs appear. You can reduce danger through offerings. You can purify yourself. You can repair broken relationships with the divine. You can perform rituals that neutralize negative omens. So in this worldview, fate exists, but fate can sometimes be bent, not by defying the gods directly, but by responding correctly to the warnings. This is why the Mesopotamian sense of destiny is both heavy and flexible. Heavy because divine power is real. Flexible because divine decisions can sometimes be influenced. Now bring this into daily life again. A person gets sick. The family doesn't only ask what herb helps. They ask, why did this happen? Maybe a demon attacked. Maybe a ghost is angry. Maybe a curse was sent. Maybe a god is offended. So diagnosis involves divination too. A ritual specialist can determine whether the illness is natural, divine, demonic, or human-caused sorcery. Then treatment becomes layered. A remedy for the body, an incantation for the spirit, a ritual for the curse, a purification for the household, a protective amulet, a symbolic transfer of evil into a figurine that is buried or burned. This structure isn't random. It is a way of creating a complete response to fear. It addresses the physical and the psychological at the same time. Now let's talk about sorcery because it's a huge background presence. People believe that enemies can target you invisibly, not with an army, but with intention, with words, with cursed objects, with rituals performed in secret. So there are defensive measures, counter incantations, protective charms, household rituals, legal penalties for accusations in some contexts, but there's also a social function here. Sorcery accusations can become a way to explain misfortune. If a harvest fails, maybe someone cursed the field. If a man becomes ill, maybe someone envied him. If a pregnancy ends tragically, maybe an enemy targeted the mother. This can reduce the feeling that the universe is random, even if it increases the feeling that people are dangerous, which creates another cycle. Fear leads to protection rituals, and protection rituals reinforce the idea that danger is everywhere. Now shift from omens to dreams, because dreams in Mesopotamia are not treated as meaningless brain noise. Dreams are treated like a channel, a place where gods and spirits can send messages. So dream interpretation becomes another field of expertise. Kings record dreams. Common people report dreams. Priests interpret dreams. A dream can be a warning. A dream can be an instruction. A dream can be a sign of favour. A dream can be a threat. And because dreams are personal, this makes the divine feel intimate. The gods are not only in temples. They can enter your sleep. They can speak in images. They can demand action. They can comfort or terrify. Now take this whole Omen world and connect it to warfare again. Because war is not only fought with weapons, war is fought with legitimacy. If you win, you declare the gods favoured you. If you lose, you claim the gods were angry, or you were betrayed, or the enemy's god temporarily prevailed. The theological explanation is flexible enough to handle any outcome. But it also does something powerful. It keeps the society's worldview intact. Victory does not shatter the system. Defeat does not shatter the system. Everything can be explained within divine order, which means the structure survives. Now, because war is constant, the cities become specialists in siege tactics. Walls, towers, gates, moats, defensive dikes. And in response, attackers develop rams, tunnelling ramps, ladders, siege towers. Sieges are slow and brutal. Inside the city, hunger becomes a weapon. Disease becomes a weapon. Fear becomes a weapon. Outside the city, exhaustion becomes a weapon. But through all of it, the gods remain present in interpretation. A bad omen during a siege can cause panic. A good omen can cause courage. A ritual performed correctly can be seen as strengthening the walls spiritually as much as physically. Now let's talk about something that can sound strange until you see the logic. The removal of divine statues during conquest. When an army captures a city, one of the greatest humiliations is carrying away the god's statue. This is not treated like stealing a symbol, it is treated like capturing the god, because the god is believed to dwell in the statue. So to remove the statue is to remove protection. It's an act of spiritual disarmament. It also sends a message to the people: your divine guardian has been taken. Your cosmic support is gone. This can break morale. It can destabilize the city. And that's why returning a statue can be a massive political event. A restored statue means restored order, a restored relationship with the divine. Now think about what this means psychologically. People live inside a reality where divinity is physically present, not as abstract belief, but as objects that receive food, clothing, washing, and attention. And if that object is destroyed or taken, the city feels spiritually exposed. So temple ritual is not optional comfort. It is perceived as civic defense. Now bring this back to the Anunnaki idea again. The Anunnaki are often imagined as the divine assembly, the high-ranking forces that control decisions. In human society, the assembly is mirrored by councils, elders, priesthood circles, palace officials. But in myth, the council isn't just political, it's cosmic. It decides whether humans exist. It decides whether kingship is granted. It decides whether disaster comes. So to live in this world is to live in a layered governance system. Human leaders govern. Divine leaders govern above them. Signs reveal the divine mood. Rituals adjust the relationship. Now here's a critical point. This kind of worldview creates stability, but it also creates pressure. If a bad harvest happens, you can't simply say nature is unpredictable. You must ask who offended whom. If plague spreads, you can't simply say disease happens. You must ask what curse has entered the city. So the society becomes highly concerned with correctness, with ritual precision, with moral behaviour, but also with proper procedure. This is why lists and manuals are everywhere. Ritual manuals, omen manuals, medical manuals, word lists, training tablets. Because knowledge is survival. If you do not know the correct ritual, you might invite chaos. If you do not know the correct interpretation, you might make the wrong decision. And the wrong decision can destroy the city. So the scribal tradition becomes sacred not only because it preserves stories, but because it preserves instructions for staying alive. Now pause and consider how this shapes the human self-image. If humans are created from clay and divine blood, they are mixed beings, part earth, part divine. That means humans can participate in cosmic order, but they can also disrupt it. They can become noisy. They can become arrogant. They can become rebellious. They can become careless. So the system must constantly correct human behaviour, not through constant punishment, but through constant ritual maintenance. This is why temples are busy every day. This is why festivals exist. This is why omens are consulted. This is why protective rituals are common. It's a civilization that treats stability as a daily achievement. And that's the atmosphere in which Mesopotamian myth makes sense. A world where fate whispers through signs. A world where power must be justified as divine. A world where disaster is never far away. A world where you can't stop paying attention because paying attention is how you survive. Now let's move into something that sounds ceremonial, but in Mesopotamia, it functions almost like an engine that restarts the universe on a schedule. The great festivals, because daily rituals keep the relationship going, but festivals are when a city tries to renew the whole system at once. This is when the gods are not only fed and dressed in private, but shown, moved, celebrated, reaffirmed in public space. And when you think about life after the divine order is established, you have to picture an entire population stepping into a ritual that they believe affects reality itself. not metaphorically, literally. A festival is not entertainment. It's maintenance on the cosmos. Now, different cities have different traditions, but there are patterns you see again and again. There's purification. There are processions. There are offerings on a massive scale. There are recitations of foundational stories. There are symbolic battles. There are moments where the king is humbled and then restored. There are sacred unions meant to guarantee fertility. And there is always the underlying anxiety that if something is done wrong, the order could break. So imagine the mood. It's celebration on the surface. Food, drink, music, crowds, priests in robes, drums singing. But under it there's tension, because this is a moment when the border between order and chaos feels thin. The new year is especially intense. It's the reset point. And in many Mesopotamian contexts, the New Year festival runs for many days, with each day having specific actions. The city becomes a stage. The gods are present in their statues. The king is present as the human anchor of authority. The people are present as the body that keeps the city alive. And the point is to get the gods to keep favouring that city for another cycle. Fertility. Peace, stable water, good harvest, successful trade, protection from enemies. So what happens during one of these festivals? First, purification. The city is cleansed. The temple is cleansed. Priests cleanse themselves. Objects are washed. Incense is burned. Water is used ritually, sometimes taken from sacred sources. The idea is to remove pollution because pollution attracts danger. And danger in this worldview is not just physical, it's spiritual imbalance. After purification comes reaffirmation. The gods are honoured. Hymns are sung. Offerings are increased. And then comes a key moment, the story. A foundational text is recited, not for fun, for function, because telling the story is part of making the story real again. Reciting creation is part of renewing creation. Reciting divine victory is part of maintaining divine victory. This is why these myths are not only narratives, they are tools. They are used, they are deployed, they are activated. So when a creation epic is recited, the city is not just remembering where it came from, it is rebinding itself to the divine framework that makes it legitimate. Now, the king's role in this is fascinating, because kingship is seen as descending from the divine realm. It's not just a political position, it's a cosmic function. The king is expected to maintain justice, maintain temples, maintain irrigation, maintain defence, and if he fails, the city suffers. So in festivals, the king undergoes rituals that reinforce his mandate. In some contexts, there is even a moment where the king is stripped of symbols, humiliated, reminded that he is not divine, then restored, reclothed, recrowned. The message is your authority depends on the gods. It can be removed. It can be renewed. You are powerful, but you are also accountable. This is brilliant political theatre, but it's also sincere ritual in the world view. The king's humility is part of stabilising reality. Now there's another ritual that always catches modern listeners, because it feels bold and direct. The sacred marriage. The idea that the union of a god and goddess must be enacted to ensure fertility, often connected with a goddess like Inanna and a divine consort figure like Dumuzi. In some cities and periods, the ritual may involve the king and a high priestess, symbolically embodying those divine roles. The hymns can be sensual, the language can be explicit, and the meaning is not scandal. The meaning is life, because fertility is the difference between abundance and starvation. So sexuality is not treated as merely private behaviour. It can be sacred technology, a ritual force that keeps the fields growing and the herds multiplying. Now imagine how this affects social psychology. If the city's survival depends on cosmic fertility, then rituals around fertility become intense. They become central. They become public events that everyone watches and judges. And that means religion is not tucked away. It is woven into crops, marriages, births, and seasons. Now let's shift to another kind of festival energy, the procession. When a god's statue is taken out of the inner sanctuary, it is a major event. Not everyone enters the temple's most sacred spaces, but on festival days, the god comes out. The statue is lifted onto a platform or carried, sometimes placed on a ceremonial boat or carts. Musicians lead the way, priests chant, crowds watch. Offerings are placed along the route. People reach out as if the god can see them and recognize them, because in their minds the god is not a symbol. The god is present. So a procession is like the deity walking through the city, blessing streets, blessing walls, blessing marketplaces, blessing families, and it creates a powerful feeling of unity. The city becomes one body moving under one divine gaze. This is how religion becomes social glue. Now festivals also serve a more direct political function. Alliances. During festival periods, delegations might arrive. Gifts are exchanged. Treaties are reaffirmed. Diplomatic marriages might be negotiated. Merchants might schedule major deals. So the festival is also an economic and political node. The city is open. The population is gathered. The mood is heightened. It's the perfect time to reinforce relationships. Now pause and connect this to the mythic idea that war between cities is also war between gods. If your city's patron deity must be seen as strong, then a successful festival is also a display of divine power. A wealthy temple means the god is honoured. A massive procession means the god is present. A disciplined ritual means the city is orderly. Everything becomes a signal to other cities. We are favoured. We are protected. We are stable. And stability itself is a kind of power. Now here's where this gets even deeper. Festivals also highlight the fear that the gods can leave. If a city is defeated, one explanation is that the gods abandoned it. Not permanently maybe, but withdrew protection. This is why cities panic when omens turn negative. This is why kings rush to rebuild temples. This is why a statue being removed is devastating. Because the presence of the god is the difference between a living city and a doomed one. So festivals are not only a celebration of divine presence, they are a pleading, a negotiation, a reinforcement, a reminder to the god, stay with us. We are doing what we are supposed to do. We are feeding you. We are honouring you. We are maintaining your house. Now picture what happens if something goes wrong. A ritual is performed incorrectly. An offering is late. A priest violates purity rules. A festival is interrupted by violence or bad weather. Even if the event continues, people remember that something fell off. That can produce dread. It can produce scapegoating. It can produce frantic corrective rituals. Because the city cannot tolerate the idea that the cosmic order has cracked. So it tries to patch it quickly. Now we can bring this back to the idea of the Anunnaki as the assembly of high gods. A festival is in a sense a city's way of communicating upward, of proving its loyalty to the divine hierarchy, of demonstrating that humans are still doing their role, which in myth begins as labour but expands into ritual preservation and maintenance. So the story of humans being created to serve becomes visible in the festival itself. Serve through offerings, serve through discipline, serve through the proper performance of ancient patterns, and in serving the city, believes it earns protection and fertility. Now if you want to imagine what it feels like inside this worldview, imagine that everything you do has cosmic weight. Your city's behaviour matters. Your king's purity matters. Your temple's order matters. Your offerings matter. Not as private spirituality, but as civic infrastructure. Because if the gods withdraw, your canals might fail. Your harvest might fail. Your enemies might win. your children might die. That's not a metaphor. That's the lived fear of a river civilization. So festivals are moments when that fear becomes organized into action, into music, into processions, into recitations, into feasting that says we are still here, we are still functioning, we are still alive. And the gods, if they are pleased, will let us continue. That's what celebration means in this setting. Not escape from reality, but a deliberate attempt to secure reality for one more cycle. Now let's step out of the temple district for a moment and walk into the streets where ordinary life happens, because a civilization isn't just myths and rituals, it's also contracts, households, quarrels, debts, love, hunger, jokes, and the constant problem of how to make tomorrow happen. And this is where the clay tablets get strangely intimate, because alongside myths and hymns there are letters, arguments, receipts, marriage agreements, loan documents, complaints to officials, lists of missing sheep, reports about stolen goods. You start to realize something important. These people weren't living inside a story, they were living inside a system, and that system had to work every day. So what does daily life look like in a Mesopotamian city where the gods are believed to be active and where civilization is held together by irrigation and administration? First, the household. The basic unit is the extended family. A house is not just a couple and children. It can include grandparents, unmarried siblings, married sons with wives, children and servants, or enslaved people. It is an economic unit, a labour unit, a security unit. And because life is risky, family is survival. Now imagine the physical space. Mud brick walls, a central courtyard, rooms built around that courtyard. Cooking happens there. Weaving can happen there. Children play there. Animals may be kept in or near the compound. During the heat of the day, people retreat into shaded rooms. During the evening, the courtyard becomes livable again. The house is built for climate and privacy, and while the temples dominate the skyline, most of life happens inside these quiet courtyard spaces, where the outside world becomes a muffled sound beyond the walls. Now move outward into the city itself. The streets are narrow, winding, practical. There's traffic, but not modern traffic. Donkeys, carts, people carrying baskets, labourers hauling bricks, water carriers, children running, merchants calling out prices. And there's always dust. Always. Even in the best neighbourhood. Now what keeps this city alive is the grain and the canal water behind it. So labour is constant. Men work in fields outside the city. They dredge canals. They repair dikes. They haul goods. They build. They serve as soldiers when needed. Women run the household, but that doesn't mean they only stay inside. Women brew beer. Women weave cloth. Women work in temple workshops. Women can own property in some periods and places. Women appear in business records. Women serve as priestesses, sometimes controlling major resources. So daily life is not a simple separation of roles. It is layered and practical, but the society is still hierarchical. That matters, because hierarchy touches everything. There are elites, priests, officials, merchant families, craft workers, field labourers, and enslaved people. And legal outcomes can depend on your status. Punishments can depend on your status. Your ability to fight back against an accusation can depend on your status. So when we talk about law, we're not talking about modern equality. We're talking about a system meant to preserve order. Now let's focus on contracts, because this is where civilization becomes visible in a way people don't always notice. Contracts are everywhere. Marriage is a contract. Loans are contracts. Adoptions can be contracts. Apprenticeships are contracts. Land sales, house sales, slave sales, barley rations, delivery agreements, all documented. And the tablets record details with a precision that feels shockingly familiar. Names, dates, witnesses, measurements, penalties, signatures in the form of seals. It's bureaucracy. It's paperwork. It's the skeleton of urban life. Now picture a merchant or a household head taking a loan. Maybe the harvest was bad. Maybe a child is getting married and a bride price must be paid. Maybe a business venture needs capital. A loan might be barley or silver. There are interest rates. There are deadlines. There are collateral arrangements. And if the debt isn't paid, consequences follow. People can lose land. People can lose freedom. Debt slavery exists. Sometimes a person sells themselves or a family member into service temporarily to pay debt. So the city is not just temples and myths. It's also financial stress. It's also the anxiety of owing. It's also the fear of falling into poverty. And this is why law codes and court records matter, because conflict is constant. People fight over property boundaries, over inheritance, over water rights, over stolen animals, over unpaid wages, over marriage disputes. So the city needs a mechanism to settle disputes without collapsing into endless personal revenge. Now, law in this context is interesting because it's public, but it is also tied to divine legitimacy. Kings present themselves as chosen to enforce justice. Justice is not only social good, it's cosmic order. So when a king issues a set of laws, he is not only regulating behaviour, he is performing a sacred role. He is showing that the city is aligned with the divine principles. But the application is still human. Courts are human. Witnesses lie sometimes. Officials can be corrupt. People can try to manipulate outcomes. So you get this mix of ideal and reality. A belief that justice should be consistent and the messy truth that people are people. Now let's talk about marriage because it shows how personal life and economic structure fuse together. Marriage is typically arranged by families, not necessarily loveless, but not based on romance first. The goals are alliance, stability, reproduction, labour, partnership. There's a bride price from the groom's family. There's a dowry from the bride's family. The contract may specify conditions for divorce. It may specify what happens if the woman is infertile. It may specify what property belongs to whom. This is not modern emotion-driven marriage. It is a legal and economic bond. And since inheritance is crucial, producing sons is a major social pressure. If you have sons, you have continuity. If you do not, your memory fades. Your property may be scattered. Your household may be absorbed by others. And in a culture where being remembered is one of the only forms of immortality, children are also memory insurance. Now, divorce exists. It can happen. It may be easier for men depending on time and place. But divorce is not unimaginable. It is part of the legal ecosystem. And again, the tablets show it. Dry practical language that tells you what people actually did, not just what ideals said. Now, childhood. Children are valued, but they are not treated as fragile treasures. Childhood is short. Kids work. They learn the household trade. They watch. They mimic. They carry water. They gather fuel. They help with animals. And education, formal education, is mostly for elites. Scribal school is intense. Hours of copying. Memorizing signs. Learning lists. Learning math tables. Being disciplined sometimes harshly. And why so harsh? Because scribes are not just writers. They are administrators. They hold the keys to record keeping. And record keeping is power. If you can read, you can manage grain. If you can manage grain, you can manage labour. If you can manage labour, you can manage a city. So scribal training is like training the nervous system of the state. Now let's touch on something that runs like a shadow through daily life, disease and death. Illness is constant. Water can be contaminated. Insects spread disease. Malnutrition weakens people. Infections can kill. Childbirth can kill. Injury can kill. And since the afterlife is imagined as bleak, death is not softened by the idea of paradise. Death is feared. It is also treated as a transition that requires careful management. Burials matter. Offerings matter. Grave rituals matter. Because the dead can become restless. Ghosts can trouble the living. A neglected dead relative can bring misfortune. So the living maintain relationships with the dead through ritual, not because it's poetic, but because it's practical survival in the world view. Now step back and look at this entire picture. A city where religion and economy are intertwined, where the temple is a spiritual centre and an economic powerhouse, where the palace is a political centre and a redistribution hub, where families are labour units, where contracts are social glue, where omens guide decisions, where disease and death press constantly, where war is always possible. And yet within all of that, people still laugh. They still drink beer. They still gossip. They still fall in love inside the structure that was arranged for them. They still tell stories. They still sing hymns. They still write proverbs. They still complain about their jobs. And the tablets preserve these human textures. That's the part that makes Mesopotamia feel alive. Not only the gods, but the people. Not only the Anunnaki, but the neighbour arguing over a boundary stone. Not only cosmic order, but a mother trying to keep a child alive through winter. Not only kingship, but a young student in a tablet house, wishing the teacher would stop hitting him and let him go home. This is what civilization looks like on the ground. 1,000 small struggles stabilised by shared systems, held together by belief and record keeping. And once you see that, you understand something deeper. The mythic story of humanity being created to labour doesn't stay in myth. It becomes the daily rhythm. Work in fields, work in workshops, work in temples, work in record rooms, work in kitchens, work in canals. But out of that labour comes something else. Not only survival, culture, memory, identity, and a city that for all its fragility can last long enough to leave its words behind for people thousands of years later to read. Now let's move into the darker side of this world, because if you want the full picture of what life becomes under this divine framework, you have to face the things people feared most. Not just famine, not just war, but the invisible threats, the signs, the curses, the sense that the world is filled with messages you might misunderstand. And if you misunderstand them, you suffer. This is where divination, omens, and protective magic become everyday technology. Because in Mesopotamia, uncertainty is everywhere. The rivers can betray you. A child can get sick overnight. A business deal can collapse. A rival city can invade. So people hunger for a way to know what the gods intend. What's coming? What must be avoided? And the answer culturally is that the gods speak through signs. The universe is not random. It is readable, if you know how. So let's talk about divination first, because divination isn't a fringe practice. It's central. Kings rely on it. Generals rely on it. Merchants rely on it. Families rely on it. Before major decisions, someone wants an omen. Should we go to war? Should we sign this treaty? Should we plant now? Should we marry this person? Should we build this canal? Should we move this statue? Should we punish this official? These are not only political questions, they're cosmic questions. So trained specialists interpret signs. And the most prestigious kind is extispicy, reading the organs, especially the liver, of a sacrificed animal. This sounds strange to modern ears, but here's the logic in their worldview. The gods control reality. The gods can inscribe their intentions into matter. The liver as a central organ becomes a map, a microcosm. The diviner studies its shape, colour markings and anomalies. Each feature corresponds to a meaning, And this meaning is not improvised. It is catalogued, written down, preserved. There are Omen compendia, basically handbooks of interpretation. If this feature appears, then this outcome. If that feature appears, then that danger. So divination becomes an organised knowledge system. And because it is organised, it gains authority. A king can say the gods warned us. A king can also say the gods approve. Either way, the decision becomes legitimised by divine reading. Now, beyond liver reading, there are other methods. Oil divination, dropping oil into water and watching the patterns. Smoke divination, dream interpretation, astronomical omens, unusual animal births, lightning strikes, eclipses, unseasonal storms. Everything can be a sign. This is a world where nature is language. So when an eclipse happens, it's not just a shadow, it's a message, often interpreted as danger to the king, which leads to something fascinating and very practical. Substitute king rituals. If the omen says the king is doomed, sometimes the solution is not resignation. It's substitution. A temporary stand-in is placed on the throne, treated like a king, then later removed, sometimes killed. The idea is to trick the doom, to redirect the fate, to satisfy the cosmic demand without losing the real king. This is how seriously omens are taken, not as symbols, as active forces. Now you might ask, if fate is decreed, why bother? Here's the key tension in Mesopotamian thought. Fate exists, but fate can sometimes be negotiated, altered, deferred. Divination tells you what the gods are leaning toward. Ritual tells you how to push back. Offerings, purifications, prayers, magic, repentance. Not in the modern moral sense necessarily, but in the sense of restoring correct relation. So people live inside a constant feedback loop. Read signs, perform rituals, read signs again. This is how they manage anxiety. Now this leads naturally to protective magic, because if the world is filled with invisible threats, you need defences. And in this worldview, defences are both physical and spiritual. Amulets, incantations, ritual washings, protective figurines, apotropaic objects placed in walls and doorways, because the threshold of a house is a vulnerable point. The doorway is where a demon might enter. The window is where a curse might slip in. The bed at night is a vulnerable place because sleep is when the mind is open. So protection is built into architecture, into daily routines, into jewellery, into small objects buried beneath floors. Now illness sits at the centre of this, because illness can be explained in multiple ways. Sometimes it's practical contaminated water injury infection. Sometimes it's divine punishment. Sometimes it's demonic attack. Sometimes it's sorcery by an enemy. So treatment also has multiple layers. A physician might apply herbs and bandages. An exorcist priest might perform rituals and incantations. Families might offer gifts to a specific god associated with the illness. They might change behaviour, adjust offerings, cleanse the house. It's not either or. It's all of it, because the stakes are life and death. Now we need to talk about sorcery, because fear of sorcery is real and intense. People believe enemies can curse them, cause impotence, cause business failure, cause a child to die, cause a spouse to leave, cause madness. And since many misfortunes have unclear causes, sorcery becomes a convenient explanation. So there are rituals to counteract it. A person might commission a specialist to make a figurine representing the enemy. The figurine can be burned, buried, drowned, or broken symbolically, destroying the curse. There are rituals where impurity is washed away and carried off into the river. There are incantations spoken over water, over fire, over oil. There are lists of demons named and commanded to leave, because naming is power. If you can name the threat, you can control it. Now, the line between acceptable magic and forbidden sorcery is not about technique. It's about legitimacy. Authorized priests perform rituals openly for protection with divine sanction. Sorcerers work in secret, harming others outside social approval. So the same kind of ritual logic can be used in two moral frames. And that creates tension, because when someone suffers, they may accuse a neighbour, and accusations can escalate. So the city needs legal controls. And again, you see the interlocking systems. Mythology gives the worldview. Priests give the ritual toolkit. Law gives the social regulation. Now let's step into the underworld concept, because it shapes fear more than people realise. If the afterlife is a shadow world where the dead eat dust and clay, then death is not a reward. It is a loss. It is a dim continuation. So people become obsessed with being remembered, because memory is the only relief. If you have descendants, they pour libations, make offerings, keep your name alive. If you don't, you fade. And fading is horror. So funerary practices matter. Burial matters. Grave goods matter. Offerings matter. Because a neglected dead person can return as a ghost. And ghosts in this worldview are not poetic spirits. They are dangerous. They can cause illness, nightmares, misfortune. So families try to maintain the dead properly. This adds another burden to life, another set of duties. But it also reinforces family structure. It reinforces having children. It reinforces obeying obligations. Because if you break family ties, you weaken your protection in life and in death. Now, when you combine all this, you get a society where the unseen is treated as actionable. A bad dream is not brushed off. It's examined. An unusual birth is not shrugged at. It's interpreted. A strange pattern in smoke is not ignored. It's read. A sudden illness is not only treated physically, it's treated spiritually. This produces a world that is intensely meaningful. Every event can matter. Every accident can be a message. And in a way that is both comforting and exhausting. Comforting because it implies order. Exhausting because it implies constant responsibility. Now here's a crucial point. This is not a naive society. This is a sophisticated one. They build canals. They calculate volumes. They run complex economies. They catalogue stars. And they also read omens. Because those things are not contradictions inside their worldview. They are different ways of managing reality. The same city that produces mathematical tablets also produces Omen compendia. The same scribal tradition that preserves epics preserves exorcism rituals. So if you imagine Mesopotamia as pure superstition, you miss what it actually is. It's an integrated system. And within that system, the gods are not distant. They are immediate. They are close enough that you have to worry about them daily. Which means life after the divine order is established is not calm. It is structured. It is managed. It is policed by signs. It is negotiated through ritual. It is stabilized through constant attention. And this constant attention is one of the reasons the civilization can hold together despite fragility. Because when everything can fall apart, you build habits that keep it from falling apart. Even if those habits include reading the liver of a sheep before marching an army. Even if those habits include hanging protective charms on a doorway. Even if those habits include reciting an incantation over a sick child. This is how people survive. By turning fear into procedure. By turning uncertainty into interpretation. By turning vulnerability into ritual action. And in their minds, this isn't fantasy. It's responsibility. It's what it means to live in a world ruled by divine powers that can be persuaded, angered, soothed, or tricked. A world where order is not automatic, but maintained. And that maintenance is the daily work of being human in the land between the rivers. Now let's take the final step of this journey and look at the thing that makes all of this possible. The thing that outlasts the temples, outlasts the kings, outlasts even the language. Writing. Because if there's one miracle in this story that we can touch with our hands, it's not a god descending from the sky, it's a human being pressing meaning into clay, and that act changes everything. Not just for Mesopotamia, for the entire human future. So, picture the moment. A scribe sits with a lump of wet clay. It's not glamorous, it's not romantic, it's work. The clay is shaped into a tablet. The surface is smoothed. Then the stylus comes down wedge by wedge, not drawing pressing, angles, strokes, patterns. Each sign learned through repetition. Each sign remembered by muscle memory. The scribe is writing something that matters. A delivery, a contract, a hymn, a royal inscription, a myth, a list of omens, a complaint, a prayer, a story about a flood. And here's what's incredible. When that tablet dries, the moment becomes permanent. A voice becomes a thing. An idea becomes an object. Time stops being a wall. Now it becomes a corridor. That is the real shift. Because before writing, memory lives in people. If people die, memory dies. But with writing, memory becomes external, transferable, collectible, copyable. And once you can copy, you can preserve. Once you can preserve, you can build a tradition that outlives any one person. That's why scribal culture becomes sacred. Not because the stylus is magic, because it defeats forgetting. Now notice how this changes power. When you can write, you can record debts. When you can record debts, you can enforce repayment. When you can write laws, you can claim consistency. When you can archive omens, you can claim authority. When you can keep accounts, you can run large institutions. This is why temples and palaces become tablet factories, because writing is the nervous system of the city, and scribes are the people who operate it. Now think about libraries, not modern quiet rooms with shelves, more like rooms or courtyards filled with baskets and jars of tablets, stacks, catalogues. Sometimes tablets labelled on the edge so you can find them. And within these libraries, you don't just have myths. You have work documents, which means you have the rhythm of daily life preserved. And that rhythm is how modern scholars reconstruct the civilization. Now here's another quiet shock. Many of these tablets were not written with the intention of being sacred literature. They were written to be used, to be filed, to be referenced, to be copied, which means the people writing them weren't thinking about us. They were thinking about their own problems. But because clay can survive, and because dry climates can preserve, and because ruins can bury their routine paperwork becomes a time capsule. A simple receipt can outlive an empire. Now move forward to the point where the script changes. It starts as pictographs, little images. Then it shifts toward wedges. The symbols become abstract, faster to write, more flexible, more powerful. And once the system matures, it can carry anything. A prayer, a threat, a song, a myth, a joke, a math problem, an astronomical observation. So the clay tablet becomes the universal container of thought. Now when you reach the period of great copying, you see something else. The scribes aren't only writing new things, they're preserving older things. They copy ancient hymns, they copy myths, they copy epics, they translate, adapt, reframe. Sometimes they introduce changes because copying is not perfect. Sometimes they merge traditions. Sometimes they add explanatory lines. Sometimes they update language. So even within the tablets, you can watch culture move. Not like a museum, like a living organism. And this is why the story of the Anunnaki doesn't stay fixed. The term shifts, the roles shift, the focus shifts. Sometimes the Anunnaki are the great gods. Sometimes they're underworld judges. Sometimes they're a vast divine assembly. And later, cultures adopt them, rename them, rearrange hierarchy. But the written tradition keeps the core alive. Now eventually, the writing system fades. It's slow, difficult, specialized. Other scripts become more efficient. Empires change. Languages change. Aramaic spreads. alphabetic writing takes over. The old scribal schools close. The last tablets are written, and then silence. For centuries, people walk past ruins and see strange marks and have no idea what they say. The cities become mounds. The mounds become part of the landscape, and the words sleep in the earth. Now here comes the modern turning point. Excavations uncover tablets, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, but they are unreadable. At first they're just objects with mystery scratches. So decoding becomes the new kind of labour. Scholars compare inscriptions. They identify repeated patterns. They use multilingual inscriptions as keys. They build sign lists. They build dictionaries. They argue about grammar. They reconstruct broken lines. They debate meanings. And slowly a dead voice becomes audible again. That moment is one of the strangest triumphs in human history. Not conquest, not empire, translation. Because translation brings back an entire civilization's mind. And once those texts become readable, the myths return. The flood story emerges. The creation myths emerge. The epics emerge. The hymns emerge. The legal codes emerge. And suddenly the modern world discovers that some of its most familiar stories have ancient cousins. That realization is massive, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it shows continuity. It shows that human storytelling travels. It mutates. It crosses languages. It gets reinterpreted. It becomes tradition. And that's when you see why it matters to read these texts accurately. Because when you read them accurately, you see them as they are. Not as modern fantasies, not as simple alien stories, not as crude superstition, but as complex explanations created by intelligent people facing real problems. Floods, drought, disease, war, death, power, work, and the desire to make order out of chaos. Now this is where modern sensationalism often steps in. Someone reads a line about gods coming down. Someone sees a phrase like from heaven or from above, and they jump. They turn poetry into literal spacecraft. They turn divine blood into genetics. They turn mythic labour into industrial mining. But when you do that, you lose the actual genius of the text. Because the real genius is not that they predicted modern ideas. The real genius is that they built an intellectual system that made sense of their world. A system that connected cosmic structure to social structure. That tied kingship to divine mandate. That tied law to order. That tied agriculture to sacred duty. That tied writing to memory. And within that system, the Anunnaki are not aliens. They are the highest powers in a moral and cosmic hierarchy. They are the explanation for why civilization exists and why it is hard, why work is necessary, why authority can be harsh, why mercy can be subversive, why humans are both earth and something more. Now here's the final quiet piece of this. The clay tablets are not only information, they are proof of intention. A person cared enough to preserve something. A student copied a hymn because a teacher demanded it. A priest copied a ritual because it had to be done right. A king commissioned an inscription because he wanted to be remembered. A merchant recorded a debt because he needed security. All of these motivations leave marks, and those marks become history. Not history as a list of dates, but history as the texture of being alive. So when you ask what happens after these gods establish civilization, one answer is brutally practical. Administration happens. Contracts happen. Education happens. Ritual happens. War happens. Trade happens. Disease happens. Families happen. And through it all, writing happens. Meaning becomes portable. Memory becomes a thing. And that is why these stories survive when everything else collapses. Temples burn, cities fall, empires dissolve. But clay baked or dried can sit in the ground and wait. And when someone finally reads it again, the story resumes. Not because the gods return, but because the human voice returns. And that is the real legacy of the land between the rivers. The invention not only of cities, but of remembrance. Now as we close this part, just sit with the image of it. A small tablet. Rough edges, wedge marks across the surface. A message written by someone who never knew your world existed. And yet here you are, hearing their world again. That's the bridge. That's the continuity. That's how the story stays alive. Not through mystery, but through the very human urge to leave a trace. To say I was here, this happened. Remember.